Welcome to Dark Horror Diaries, my friend. Before the show starts, do write below where are you from. Also, do hit that like button and subscribe. Let's go. My name's Mike, and I didn't want to leave the city, not at first. But after the years spent working as a forest ranger, the noise, the traffic, the constant pressure, it all became too much. I needed peace, and this small town nestled on the outskirts of a sprawling forest seemed like the perfect escape. The house I bought sat on a few acres, far enough from the neighbors to give me some solitude, but close enough to the town that I wouldn't feel completely cut off. Or so I thought. The town's residents weren't exactly thrilled about my move. They didn't say it outright, but I could feel their hesitation. People like me, outsiders, didn't tend to stick around, and I get it. This town's been around for decades, maybe longer, and its ways run deep. But I was determined to make it work, so I kept to myself, focused on my work, and started to explore the surrounding woods when I had the chance. There was one person, though, who I couldn't quite figure out. My neighbor, Adam. I hadn't seen much of him, but I'd heard plenty. A reclusive figure, he kept to himself, hardly ever leaving his property. It wasn't the kind of house that drew attention. Nothing remarkable about it. But there was something unsettling about the way he carried himself. The town whispered about him, though no one would say anything concrete. Some said he was eccentric, others hinted at darker things I couldn't shake from my mind once I started hearing them. What really piqued my curiosity, though, were the sounds. At night, from my porch, I'd hear it. Deep growls like an animal in distress, coming from Adam's yard. At first, I thought I was hearing things, or maybe it was just a wild animal nearby. But the sounds became more frequent and more distinct as the days went on. It wasn't like anything I'd heard before, not in my years in the woods. These sounds felt deliberate. I tried not to let it bother me, but after a few nights, I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was too strange. One evening, when the growls were louder than usual, I grabbed a flashlight and decided to investigate. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. Maybe a caged animal, maybe something more sinister. But whatever it was, I needed to know. I slipped through the trees, keeping to the shadows, careful not to make a sound. Adam's house was a good distance from mine, but as I approached, the growls grew louder. They were coming from behind his barn. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept closer. The barn was dark, with only the faintest light creeping through the cracks in the walls. I could hear the creature now, thrashing against something, a soft rustling followed by another growl. My pulse quickened as I moved closer to the corner of the barn, and that's when I saw it. A cage hidden just behind a stack of firewood. Inside, something was pacing, something that wasn't quite animal, but wasn't quite human either. I froze, staring in disbelief. The creature in the cage had glowing eyes, like two molten orbs that seemed to burn right through the darkness. It wasn't huge, but it had the build of something powerful, its muscular form twisted in ways that felt unnatural. I didn't understand what I was looking at, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't an ordinary animal. Something far worse was going on here. The sight of the creature in the cage was burned into my mind as I made my way back to my house. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen. It didn't add up. Adam had always been a strange guy, but this was something else entirely. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled upon something far darker than I had anticipated when I first moved here. The next few days were a blur. I tried to go about my work as usual, but every time I stepped outside, my mind drifted back to that cage. I couldn't focus, couldn't stop thinking about the creature, about Adam's connection to it. I needed answers, but I didn't know where to start. The town was tight-lipped about Adam, and if I asked anyone directly, I'd likely end up with more gossip than facts, so I decided to confront him. The evening was overcast, the kind of sky that made everything feel muted, like the world was holding its breath. I walked down the dirt road that separated our properties, my hands clenched at my sides. I wasn't sure what I was going to say to Adam, but I knew I had to find out what was going on. As I neared his house, I noticed the front door was ajar, the light from inside spilling out onto the porch in a soft glow. I hesitated for a moment, then knocked. The door creaked open just a crack, and I was greeted by the faint smell of something rancid like old meat. Adam stood there in the doorway, his face partially obscured by a dark, unkempt beard. His eyes were narrow, and he didn't look surprised to see me, which was odd. It was as if he'd been expecting me. You've been hearing it too, haven't you? Adam asked, his voice rough and hoarse, like it hadn't been used much. I nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. What's going on, Adam? What are you keeping back there? He didn't answer immediately, his gaze drifting past me to the trees that lined the edge of the property. His eyes seemed distant, almost as if he were lost in thought. Finally, he spoke again, his voice lower this time. It's not what you think, he said, the words heavy with a strange kind of reverence. It's something old. It's part of this land. And I've been feeding it, keeping it contained. But soon, it'll be free. I wasn't sure what he meant, but the words sent a chill down my spine. Something old, contained. I could feel the unease growing in the pit of my stomach. Adam, you're talking about an animal, aren't you? It doesn't belong here. He shook his head, the corners of his mouth twitching into a strange smile. No, not an animal, a creature, a guardian if you will, and it's tied to this place, to the land itself. It's been here long before either of us, and it will be here long after. Before I could respond, Adam stepped back from the door and motioned for me to follow. I hesitated, but my curiosity pushed me forward. As we walked down the narrow path to the barn, Adam's words echoed in my mind. A guardian? Was he out of his mind? Or was there something deeper to this? I had to know. We reached the barn, and I could see the cage from where I stood. The creature was still inside, pacing back and forth, but now it seemed agitated, like it sensed us approaching. Its growls were louder, more desperate. I stepped closer, my eyes never leaving it, but Adam stopped me with a hand on my arm. You don't understand, he said quietly. It's not just a creature. It's part of the land. And soon, when the moon is full, it will be free. It's the only way to restore balance. I felt my heart skip a beat. Restore balance? What kind of madness was this? The creature was more than just an animal. It was something ancient, something Adam believed had a purpose, something that could unleash chaos upon the world. I can't let you do this, Adam, I said, my voice firm. This thing doesn't belong here. It's dangerous. It's out of control. Adam's gaze hardened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something dark in his eyes. You don't know anything about it, he spat. You can't understand, but you will. Soon, you'll see what it can do. I stood there, frozen, trying to process everything I just heard. The full moon was only days away. I had to stop him. But how? How could I possibly face whatever this creature was? And if Adam was willing to release it, then he was as dangerous as the creature itself. The next few days passed in a blur of confusion and dread. I couldn't stop thinking about what Adam had said. A guardian? A creature tied to the land? I couldn't make sense of it, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to stop whatever was about to happen. I couldn't just sit by and let Adam release whatever this thing was into the world. But how could I, a simple forest ranger, possibly confront something like that? I spent the following nights outside, watching the sky, listening for any sign of movement from Adam's property. The growls had stopped for now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. I spent hours trying to find any kind of evidence, but the more I searched, the more questions I had. It wasn't until the night of the full moon that I realized how much time had passed, and how much danger was looming. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the land. I couldn't sleep, so I decided to take one last look around. As I walked down the road to Adam's house, the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Something felt different, something I couldn't quite explain. I could hear it now, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps in the woods just beyond the edge of Adam's property. Someone, or something, was moving out there. I approached the barn cautiously, my heart racing in my chest. The door was cracked open, and a faint light flickered from inside. As I drew closer, I saw Adam standing at the cage, his back to me, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the lock. He was muttering to himself, something about the creature being free at last, about the balance being restored. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to stop him, and I had to do it now. As I stepped forward, the door creaked behind me, and I froze. Mike, a voice rasped from the shadows. You shouldn't have come. I turned, and there stood Adam, his face pale, his eyes wide with a strange intensity. He looked almost unrecognizable, as though whatever he'd been planning had driven him to the brink of madness. Get out of here, Adam, I said, my voice steady despite the rising panic in my chest. You don't know what you're doing. This thing, it's not some kind of guardian. It's dangerous. You're going to get us all killed." Adam laughed, a low, hollow sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "You still don't understand. It's not just an animal. It's a force of nature, something older than any of us. It's part of this land, and it needs to be free." He reached out, his hand shaking as he moved toward the cage, and that's when I saw it. The creature, it had grown larger, more menacing, its form twisted and grotesque. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural intelligence, and it paced back and forth, snarling as if it could sense the impending release. "You can't control it, Adam," I said, my voice breaking. "It's too dangerous. We have to stop it." But Adam's expression didn't change. He was beyond reason, lost in his obsession with the creature and its supposed connection to the land. I knew then that there was only one way to stop this madness. I had to destroy the creature before Adam could release it. I lunged toward the cage, hoping to somehow get to the lock before Adam could. But he was quicker. He shoved me aside, his grip tightening around a small knife he had hidden in his jacket. "Stay out of it, Mike," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't understand. I have to do this. I have to set it free." The creature was almost frenzied now, its growls turning into a terrifying roar. It was getting closer to the bars of the cage, its claws scraping against the metal as it pushed its way forward. I couldn't wait any longer. In one swift motion, I tackled Adam to the ground, knocking the knife out of his hand. The creature howled in rage, its eyes burning with fury as it reached through the bars, desperate to escape. I could feel the heat of its gaze as it snapped, its jaws just inches from my face. I had to act fast. "Mike," Adam screamed, his hands gripping my arm as he tried to pull me off. "You don't know what you're doing. You can't stop it." I pushed him off me, my chest heaving as I scrambled for the lock. With a quick wrench of my hands, the cage door flew open, and the creature surged forward, its monstrous form breaking free. It let out a blood-curdling roar that echoed through the woods, shaking the very ground beneath us. The creature erupted from the cage with a speed that left me no time to react. It was like nothing I had ever seen, a grotesque fusion of human and animal, its limbs twisted and elongated, its skin mottled with patches of fur and scales. It stood there for a moment, towering over us, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. I could feel the air crackling with the raw energy it exuded, the very atmosphere thick with a primal rage. Adam was frozen in place, his face a mask of awe and fear. "It's free," he whispered, his voice reverent, almost worshipful. "It's free." But I wasn't about to let it run rampant through the town, no matter what Adam believed. This creature wasn't some ancient guardian. It was a terror, and it was only going to destroy everything in its path. I scrambled backward, my heart racing as I reached for my flashlight, the only tool I had on hand. It was no match for what I was facing, but it was all I had. I shined it directly at the creature's face, hoping to disorient it, but the beast barely flinched. It let out another deafening roar, this time shaking the trees around us. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and I stumbled, trying to regain my balance. Adam's voice broke through the chaos. "Don't hurt it," he begged, his eyes wide and wild. "It's part of the land. It needs to be free." "Your land is cursed," I shouted back, my voice breaking with the weight of my words. "This thing is nothing but a monster. You can't control it, Adam. You never could." The creature took a step forward, its claws scraping against the earth, leaving deep gouges in the ground. It seemed to be deciding whether to attack, its eyes shifting between me and Adam, its mouth dripping with saliva. I knew I had seconds, maybe less, before it pounced. I glanced at Adam one last time. He was still standing there, a fool in the face of his own creation, but something in his eyes had shifted. The reverence had faded, replaced by a dawning horror. He was starting to realize that the creature wasn't a guardian, but a nightmare that he had unleashed, and there was no going back. I turned and ran, my boots pounding against the dirt as I headed toward the town. I had to warn the others, get them to safety. But even as I ran, I could hear the creature's footsteps behind me, crashing through the underbrush, its growls growing louder with every passing second. I could hear Adam's voice faintly in the distance, but I didn't stop. "Please, Mike, don't leave me with it," he yelled, his tone desperate. But I couldn't help him. The creature was beyond saving, and so was Adam. He had let this thing loose, and now we were all going to pay the price. I reached the edge of town and burst into the nearest house, where a group of townsfolk were gathered. They looked up in confusion as I barged in, my breath ragged, my face pale with fear. "It's here," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "The creature Adam was keeping. It's free. We need to leave. Now." A few of them stood up, hesitant, but the urgency in my voice was enough to get them moving. "Where's Adam?" one of the men asked, his eyes darting to the door. I shook my head, unable to speak. I didn't have time for questions. I had to stop the creature before it tore the town apart. But as I turned to leave, a loud crash echoed from outside. The creature had arrived. I didn't look back. I couldn't. There was no time to waste. The town had to be evacuated. Now, before it was too late. The streets of the town were eerily quiet as I rushed through them, my thoughts racing faster than my legs could carry me. The air was thick with tension, and every sound, no matter how small, sent my heart into overdrive. I could hear the creature's growls in the distance, each one growing louder, closer. It was getting closer to the town, and I had no idea how long we had before it reached us. I reached the sheriff's office, slamming the door open with more force than I intended. Inside, Sheriff Thompson looked up from his desk, his face a mix of annoyance and curiosity. But the look in my eyes must have told him everything he needed to know. "Mike," he asked, standing up, concern flashing across his face. "What's going on?" "There's a creature," I panted, my words spilling out in a frantic rush. "Adam, he kept it locked up. It's out. It's free, and it's heading for the town. You've got to get everyone out of here. Now." The sheriff's brow furrowed as he processed my words. "What the hell are you talking about, Mike? A creature? Is this some sort of joke?" "I'm not joking," I said, my voice shaking. "It's not human. It's God. You have to see it for yourself. It's a monster. Adam let it loose, and now it's coming for us. We have to leave before it gets here." For a moment, the sheriff stood there frozen, as if trying to decide whether to believe me or not. Then, without a word, he grabbed his radio and started speaking into it, his tone sharp and urgent. "We've got an emergency," he said. "Everyone needs to evacuate the town immediately. We've got a situation." I could hear the crackling of static on the other end as he relayed orders to his deputies. Within minutes, the sheriff had mobilized the town, sending people to their homes and to the outskirts to warn anyone who hadn't yet heard. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. We didn't have time to get everyone out. "Mike," Sheriff Thompson said, turning back to me. "What the hell is this thing? You said Adam was involved." I nodded, trying to steady my breath. "He thought it was a guardian of some kind, a creature tied to the land. But it's not. It's like nothing I've ever seen. It's part animal, part human, and it's angry. It's been locked up for years, and now it's free." The sheriff stared at me, disbelief still on his face. But the distant sounds of crashing trees and the low growls in the background made it clear he could no longer ignore the danger. "All right, Mike," he said, his voice gruff. "Let's go stop this thing." We rushed to the back of the office, where a squad car waited, its engine running. As we climbed in, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. There was no stopping this creature, not unless we acted quickly, and even then, I wasn't sure we stood a chance. We sped toward the outskirts of town, the sound of the creature's roars growing louder with each passing second. The sheriff's deputies had set up a perimeter, but the creature was too powerful to contain with just a few men and some makeshift barricades. As we neared the woods, I could see the trees shaking, branches snapping as the creature tore its way through the forest. The sheriff hit the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt. "This is it," he said grimly. "Get ready." I grabbed the rifle from the back seat, my hands trembling as I loaded it. My mind raced with thoughts of how to stop the creature, but I knew deep down that whatever happened, it wouldn't be easy. The thing was unstoppable, a force of nature in every sense of the word. As we stepped out of the car, the full moon illuminated the chaos before us. The creature had reached the edge of the woods, its glowing eyes scanning the area. Its massive form moved with an unnatural grace, its every step sending vibrations through the ground. "It's not just a monster," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It's a curse." Sheriff Thompson didn't respond. He just nodded, his eyes locked on the creature as it slowly approached. And then it stopped. The creature turned its head, its eyes narrowing as it focused on us. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still, and then it let out a roar so deafening that it made the air itself vibrate. It charged. "Get down," I shouted, but it was too late. The creature's charge was like a freight train. Unstoppable and terrifying. I barely had time to duck behind a nearby rock before it barreled past, its massive body shaking the ground beneath my feet. My heart raced and my mind scrambled to catch up. This wasn't a fight we could win with brute force. This was survival. The sheriff fired his gun, but the bullet seemed to have no effect. The creature howled in frustration, its claws raking through the air as it turned to face us. The moonlight glinted off its sharp, jagged features, giving it an otherworldly, almost demonic appearance. For a moment, I saw something in its eyes. A flicker of the man Adam had once been, the one who had kept the creature locked away. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by raw, primal rage. "Get to the truck," Sheriff Thompson shouted, his voice strained. "We need to regroup." I nodded, but I didn't move. I had no intention of running. Not now. Not after everything we had seen. I was done running from this nightmare. I stood, my hands still clutching the rifle, and I fired a shot into the air. The creature paused, its head snapping toward the sound. It was drawn to the noise, distracted for just a second. That was all I needed. "Come on," I yelled at the sheriff, motioning for him to take cover behind another set of rocks. He didn't hesitate. He followed my lead, both of us trying to outmaneuver the creature as it turned back toward us, its growls vibrating through the air like thunder. I knew we didn't have much time. The town was still in danger. The creature was out of control, and Adam, God Adam, was still somewhere in the woods, watching it all unfold, still believing that this was somehow the right thing to do. "We have to stop it before it gets to the town," I said to the sheriff as we moved into position. "If it makes it to the main street, it'll tear the place apart. We need to take it down here before it has the chance to destroy everything we care about." The sheriff nodded grimly. "You think we can kill it?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "But we have to try." I checked the rifle, my finger hovering over the trigger. The creature was still coming toward us, its massive frame moving with unnatural speed. I could see its muscles rippling under its fur as it lunged toward us, its mouth wide open, revealing rows of teeth like daggers. I fired. The shot didn't hit. It missed by inches, and the creature snarled, fury flashing in its eyes. But it didn't stop. It charged again. "Mike, look out." The sheriff's warning came too late. The creature was on me before I could react, slamming into me with the force of a freight train. I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me as the creature's hot breath burned my skin. It loomed over me, its claws coming down with deadly precision. In that moment, everything seemed to slow down. My thoughts raced, but my body felt frozen. I reached for my knife, hoping to get a shot in, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. The creature's strength was overwhelming, and I was nothing more than a man against a beast. But just as the creature's claws were about to strike, I heard a gunshot. The creature faltered, its eyes flickering as it turned to look at the sheriff. Another shot rang out, this time hitting its shoulder, but still it didn't fall. I didn't hesitate. I lunged for the rifle I had discarded earlier, rolling onto my back to get a better angle. I aimed for the creature's head, steadying my breath. I couldn't afford to miss this time. I pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, and this time it struck true. The creature let out a horrific screech, its body jerking as the bullet pierced its skull. It staggered back, its growls turning into an almost pitiful whimper. For a moment it seemed confused, as if it couldn't understand why it was dying. Then, with a final roar, it collapsed to the ground, its body crumpling in a heap. The air fell silent. My heart was still racing, my hands trembling, but the danger was over. The creature was dead. I stood up slowly, my knees shaking with exhaustion, and looked at the sheriff. He was breathing heavily, his eyes wide, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. "It's done," I said, my voice hoarse. "It's over." The sheriff nodded, but I could see the unease in his eyes. "What about Adam?" he asked. I looked around, but Adam was nowhere to be seen. He was still out there, somewhere in the woods, lost to his obsession. And I knew that we would never truly be free of the darkness he had unleashed. But for now, at least the town was safe. We called in the authorities, and the body of the creature was taken away. Adam's fate was left in their hands, though I knew deep down that he would never be the same again. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cursed ancient land, still held secrets, and Adam's connection to it had only scratched the surface. The town began to rebuild, but I would never forget the beast next door and the madness that had come with it. Back in April of 2013, I went through something that I haven't been able to talk about. I was paid a significant amount of money to stay quiet in return for signing a 10-year agreement to shut the hell up. Now that the time is up, I've considered my options. I could just let this go and never speak of it again. I won't gain anything from speaking out, and I got a lot to lose. But then again, this is just an anonymous post online. Words have less meaning that way. West Virginia. It was hotter than usual, without a whiff of wind. I was coming home from a visit to my aunt. She'd broken her leg and couldn't leave her house. I was making my way back home, taking the I-64 out of Lewisburg. It started with the radio. It was playing that one Macklemore song I'd heard 100 times over. The sound was cutting in and out in a quick staccato, then disappeared completely. I could hear cars honking up front as a line began to form. There was a sway in the trees as if greater and greater pressure was being put on them. I could hear wind rushing against the left side of the car, forcing me to pull the other way to compensate. I closed the sunroof as a dust cloud blew past, staining the windshield. Then a rumble. It sounded like thunder, but from the ground. Like a groaning bellow, growing louder and clearer by the second. As it reached its peak, I could see trees toppling over. A small Kia got pushed off balance and swerved off the road. As the sound died down, the road devolved into chaos. Some were desperately changing lanes, others were stepping on the brakes. I got my door scraped as the car behind me sped past. The radio was playing an automated message. A local emergency alert, referred to as a geological event. We were asked to turn off all air conditioning, slow down, and divert to the nearest exit. It repeated in a monotone voice. Geological event. No air conditioning. Slow down. Divert to nearest exit. Minutes passed. There was a line forming further down the road. Police officers blocking the lanes in all directions, leaving a highway exit as the only option. Some folks were trying to push past the barricades, but were forced back at gunpoint. I could see officers wearing gas masks and riot shields. We were waved in. I followed the exit and got directed to the right. There was an open field that was used as a sort of impromptu parking lot. Cars were being waved in and parked in a way that boxed us in, leaving no room for us to open our doors in either direction, unless we got parked at the edge. 4 lines of cars with about 10-15 vehicles per line. Surplus vehicles were directed further down the road. The place was packed. I got stuck in the second row, about 6 cars in. Pretty much everyone around me were on their phones. I didn't have anyone to call, but there seemed to be an issue getting a signal through. The radio was still repeating the emergency message. Voices were getting louder. A man 2 cars to my left leaned out of a gap in the door, screaming at the officers to answer his question. They responded immediately with a warning shot, straight into the air. "Stay in your vehicle," they screamed. "Lock your doors. I'm not telling you again." A couple of folks were filming, but there seemed to be trouble uploading. We were losing bandwidth. It didn't take long until phone signals were completely blocked. I think a video or 2 of that officer firing into the air made it online. They were patrolling back and forth. We were told to stay in our vehicles. Windows up. Doors closed and locked. Engines off. I could hear people talking in the other cars. Someone said there'd been a natural gas leak from the geological event, and that combustible engines could spark an explosion. Others were talking about a terrorist attack. There were no answers, and the officers weren't eager to talk. After about an hour, things were getting ugly. People were hungry, thirsty, and restless. One officer stepped up on the front cars, handing out water bottles, crackers, and processed cheese slices. He had to step from one car to another, denting the hoods with his steel-tipped shoes. They were also handing out thick black plastic hygiene bags for people who needed to relieve themselves. Use them, seal them, drop them out the door. Then lock up and wait. I'd crawled into the back seat, pulled down my cap, and tried to relax. I'd been playing some games on my phone, but the battery was running low. I wanted to save some, so I settled for having a nap instead. The sweat was stinging my eyes. Not because of how warm it was, but because of how nervous I was. No matter what I did, I felt trapped, and the car felt smaller and smaller. I couldn't get out if I wanted to, and it physically hurt me to think about how little control I had. Is that what claustrophobia feels like? A couple of officers were discussing something by the front line. One of them had a white cotton glove on, which he used to wipe off the hood of one of the front cars. The glove was taken off and put into a bag, which in turn was sealed with a hot air gun. I was getting the impression that our cars had been covered in something. I wasn't the only one considering it. There were 2 college kids in the car to my left, and they were discussing it too. Anthrax, one of them said. Gotta be. Nah, gold dust, the other chuckled. They don't want to share. You know what? The first groaned. I honest to God hope you're right. You're not, but I hope you are. F you. I joined in the conversation shortly after. I offered another explanation, something combustible. Something that might blow up if we started our cars. They were willing to consider this. The car behind me couldn't hear us, but the driver held up a notebook with the text. If we do know what it's go to be aliens. I couldn't tell if they were serious, but they weren't laughing about it. A man in his 50s and what looked like his daughter. There were a couple of other folks in the other cars. A man in a black shirt sort of looked like a preacher without a collar. 2 middle-aged women with a kid in the back seat. A fat man blaring Johnny Cash from his stereo. A couple with a teenage son who couldn't stop drumming on the windows. We'd been stuck for about 2, maybe 2.5 hours when a truck rolled in. One of those with a large water tank. It was unmarked, looked civilian. As it rolled in, they were calling out on the megaphone. We'll be hosing your vehicles down, they said. Keep everything locked and closed. Then we'll be covering your vehicle with protective plastic while we wait for it to dry. After that, we'll start letting you go in an orderly manner. I repeat. Most of us were relieved. It was only a matter of time now. It was getting dark. They were getting up on the cars, hosing them down thoroughly. It smelled of chlorine, so maybe they'd mixed something into the water. As they came to my car, they stepped up on it and double-checked the sunroof, making sure it was locked and secured. They sprayed the car down, bathing it in chemical stink. The kind that gets stuck to the back of your throat. It took a long time for them to finish, at least an hour or 2. After that, they were rolling out a kind of plastic cover at the short side of the lot. The kind you use to protect pools or rain covers for football fields. They used 2 squad cars to slowly drape the thing over the entire lot, securing the edges with large rocks. Please stay calm, they called out as the plastic crawled over us. I know this is uncomfortable, but this is for your own safety. Once the cleaning is done, you will be free to go. Stay inside your vehicle at all times. I repeat. I did as I was told. I stayed inside, and I watched that plastic cover sweep over me. It felt like getting buried alive. All lights went out, leaving me in complete darkness, accompanied only by the vague, disembodied voices of the others. The college kids were talking about where they were going to go after this. Someone was honking, not sure if it was to show support or discontent. Someone else was cheering. I took my last swig of water, washing down my final plain cracker. I got back in the driver's seat. I could hear as they finished moving the plastic cover and parking their squad vehicles. I waited patiently, figuring it'd be maybe another hour or so. They hadn't really given us a timeline, but I could breathe a little easier. Sort of. I was going back and forth between feeling empowered with my hands on the wheel and feeling like I was stuck in a metal coffin. It was so dark, and everything smelt of plastic and chemicals, like a car wash stuck in time. As the excitement died down, I paid more attention to the background sounds. I tried to filter out the various discussions from the nearby cars, and somewhere in the distance, I heard raised voices. It wasn't coming from the cars, but the officers. Whatever they were talking about, it was a heated discussion. An hour came and went, and people were getting impatient. More cars were honking. Others were yelling, demanding answers. I couldn't get my leg to stop shaking. The more I thought about getting out of there, the smaller the car felt. I was hyper-focusing on things I couldn't control. I was a little thirsty, and I was out of water. I needed to use the bathroom. I wanted to stretch my legs and go for a walk. I wanted to breathe fresh air and get that awful chemical taste out of my mouth. I heard cars starting, accelerating. The truck was moving somewhere off to the side. "We need you to stay in your vehicle," a voice screamed over the megaphone. "Do not leave for any reason. Stay in your vehicle. Cars speeding off. Not many, but a couple. Then quiet. The officers left us there. Everyone was quiet. A couple of folks had opened up their phones, using them as flashlights to look from car to car. Looking out at the sea of vehicles, all of us trapped under that dark cover. I could see a handful of lights cut off by sharp silhouettes. I couldn't make out who was who in the dark. It was all just people. Anonymous. I heard a gasp somewhere in the back. There was a metallic clunk, like when the officers climbed atop our cars to get us our water. There was a careful cheer as some folks figured they were taking off the plastic cover. But that wasn't it. Instead, there were more footsteps. The cheers slowly died down as more and more footsteps pattered across our cars. I stopped counting after a dozen. The silhouettes in the other cars were still. We all held our breaths, waiting for an answer to show itself. What the hell was going on? What was that sound? Somewhere off to my right, I heard a voice. "Who's up there?" It sounded like an older man. I'd seen a pickup truck that way earlier. Almost as a response, the footsteps stopped. There was a faint clicking sound like someone snapping their tongue against the roof of their mouth. Click, click. And from further away, a click in response. From somewhere to my left, another couple clicks. Then, a cascade of clicks. Dozens, maybe hundreds. There was an awful metallic noise coming from my right. Then, breaking glass. A scream cut short, followed by several irregular taps of the car horn. One of the silhouettes in the distance turned into a blur as something passed through the windshield, cutting through the plastic cover. Somewhere in the front row, the roof of a car was cut wide open. Someone was pulled up out of their seat. 2 cars back from where I was, there was more glass breaking. It sounded like a wild animal got in. I could see a weak hint of red spattered against the passenger side windows. I wasn't getting any air. I could feel my heart beating through my chest as my arms started shaking. My hands were cramped around the steering wheel, and I felt sweat dripping down my shoulders. I couldn't control it. I didn't even see what was going on, but these sounds, these screams, they awakened something primal. This was danger, a threat. My body knew long before I did. The college kids in the other car were ducking down. One of them waved a hand at me, as if telling me to get down. I nodded. I scrambled into the back seat. I couldn't see where I was putting my hands or my feet. Everything is different in the dark. As I tumbled my way over, my foot accidentally tapped the car horn. It was a quick tap, a fraction of a second. But to me, it was the loudest sound in the world. I was lying on my stomach in the back seat, and within seconds, something heavy climbed onto the hood of my car. I could feel the car buckling. It was much heavier than the man who'd passed out water bottles. I held my hands in front of my mouth to stop the panting, but I just ended up snorting up sweat instead. My nose stung as I bit my tongue, listening to every metallic groan as whatever was outside moved and shifted. Click, click. And from behind my car, a click in response. There were no lights being held up anymore. Everyone was cowering, going quiet. I pushed myself up against the door behind the driver's seat, trying to make myself as small as possible. I could hear the frame of the car complain as something slowly moved. When it came to my sunroof, there was a slight crack. That made it stop. Another crack. I silently shook my head, as if trying to ask the car to stop. That thing was going to break. And it did. My legs were showered with glass as a big blob of plastic cover dipped into my car. Something big came tumbling into the front seat, still covered in protective plastic. It twitched and spun around, its clicking turning from a careful question-like noise to a never-ending barrage. It was calling for help, alerting others, and it was cutting its way through the plastic. There were footsteps coming from every direction, some of them leaping from car to car, some of them leaping far enough to skip a car as they hurried. I was going to be swarmed within seconds. I fumbled with my hands, accidentally cutting my thumb on the broken glass. I managed to open the passenger side door, but even at its widest, and even when pressing into the college kid's car, it wasn't enough room to get out. Still, I had to try. I pressed myself into the gap and exhaled as much as I could, flattening my chest. While the thing thrashed around inside my car, I could feel my vision going faint. Black spots popped up at the edge of my vision. My arms were going weak, and yet by some miracle I made it through. As my face hit the gravel of the makeshift parking lot, I felt the burn of residual chemicals. I swallowed my instinct to run, instead staying on my stomach. forcing myself to crawl under my car. There were more of them, some climbing on, some off. My chest was pressed to the ground as the weight shifted. I heard breaking glass from the windshield and tearing fabric. Something was stuck up there, and it was furious, like a trapped animal. I could hear the college kids mumbling to one another, trying to stay calm. One assuring the other that all they had to do was stay low, stay quiet, and wait. Then, something slammed into the passenger side door, the one I'd crawled out of. The door was pressed up against the neighboring car, then fell haphazardly to the ground, completely off the hinges. An ink-black, bird-like foot touched the ground right next to me. I've looked it up since. There were 3 toes forward, 1 toe backward, all clawed. Anisotile feet similar to that of many birds of prey, except larger than a human foot and with smooth, oil-slick skin. It must have been heavy, at least 400 pounds. If the clicking noise came from its mouth, I can approximate that it was somewhere around 6'7" to 6'9". Or taller, it could have been hunched over. How it managed to walk in the gap between the vehicles is beyond me, but I suspect it was very thin. It daintily walked from my car to the others, as if scanning for something. I could barely see anything in the dark, but this thing seemed to navigate it perfectly. It didn't bump into anything. There was a tap on the glass of the car behind me, to my right, and someone got startled. A short scream, and the hunt was on. This time was different. It must have caused some kind of chain reaction, as all of a sudden the plastic cover was getting torn up left and right. People were clawing their way out of their cars. I heard someone kicking against their windshield. Another was trying to open their door. I could hear it slamming against the side of the car next to them. And off in the distance, there was gunfire. Just a couple of shots. The college kids in the car next to me slammed their doors open and followed my lead. They rolled onto the ground and under their car. There was a little more light coming in as the cover had been torn above. Their faces were red from tears, and one of them was desperately trying to call for help on his phone. The other grabbed the phone out of his hand. A short scuffle ensued, ending with them putting on a ringtone and sliding the thing as far to the left as they could. Whatever car that phone landed under was demolished. Every window broken, every passenger gone. I could hear the grinding as a seat was ripped in two and thrown away. In a matter of seconds, an entire vehicle was torn to pieces as a dozen of those things swarmed it. "Shut up," one of the college kids repeated. "Shut up, shut up, shut up." Something reached under my car. It scraped against the sole of my shoe, tearing a hole all the way to my big toe. I hurried forward, scurrying like a lizard. The college kids noticed and followed suit. I don't think they thought about it too much. It was just movement, and they went for it. I made it 2 cars down before I got stuck. There was something dark in the way, and I couldn't get around it without exposing myself. I couldn't see what it was, but it didn't take long for me to figure it out. There was a meaty crunch, as if someone was biting chunks out of a piece of meat. It was struggling to get through the fabric of their clothes, making a snapping noise as threads gave way. A pool of blood rolled under the car, staining the tip of my fingers. It was still warm. One of those things were eating a victim. I hunkered down, trying to remember to breathe. And I stayed there, waiting for a chance. Any chance. I must have stayed there for at least an hour, hearing every bite. Every crack of bone and snap of sinew. Satisfied clicking noises. As it finished its meal, it wandered off, dragging the remains along. They were moving forward. Something heavy walked over the car I was hiding under, dragging a body along. Slowly, the footsteps disappeared. It was quiet again, and in that quiet, I found my footing. I made my way to the edge of the plastic cover. I listened one final time, pushed one of the weights away, and slipped through. They were gone, and I was out. I could feel my chest growing lighter, allowing me to breathe. I wanted to cry from relief. A breeze was picking up, drying the sweat on my brow and carrying the smell of grass. Stepping back, I turned towards the sea of cars to see how bad the damage was. And then I saw one. It was a bit off to the side, perching on top of an old Honda. At a glance, it looked like a tall person, covered in a slick black ink. But looking closer, you could see the strange bird-like feet, the pointed nails, the long row of shark-like teeth on a mouth that was far too wide. I froze. The thing rose to its full length, easily over 7 feet tall. It looked ready to pounce on me. I had nothing to defend myself with. I couldn't make any sudden moves. I wouldn't even be halfway under the car before that thing would be over me. 100 thoughts raced through my mind, but there was nothing I could do. I was out of options, but the thing just looked at me. It raised a slice of raw meat. Blood dripped onto the plastic cover. It looked at me curiously, taking a bite. Then, as if nothing had happened, it wandered off, satiated. I was left there, shaking like a dry leaf. And with the last of those things gone, all that was left was the panic. It didn't take long for the officers to return. The plastic cover was removed, but we couldn't go home. Not after this. Some folks signed a waiver and were let go immediately. They weren't allowed to talk about what they'd seen, and in return, they'd get a hefty sum of insurance money. Others demanded answers and were taken into custody for obstruction of justice. A few others still were too panicked to make any kind of sense and had to be checked out by medical personnel. A total of 14 people died. It was described by a combination of causes: a traffic pileup, carbon monoxide poisoning, animal attack. I think there was something about an escaped convict too. Excuses all over the place, and the times were all wrong, spread out through a couple of days to more smoothly blend into accident statistics. And if you wanted to go home and get your insurance money, you had to sign a non-disclosure. I did too. I know the college kids did as well. Miracle they made it out, but I saw them. 34 cars had to be towed. 18 people wounded, 6 seriously so. 4 people lost at least one limb. One guy had an arm ripped off halfway up his collarbone. I don't know how he survived. Most people never saw those things up close. They just remember the screams and the breaking glass. Sometimes at night, that's all I hear too. Closing my eyes reminds me of lying under those cars, feeling the pressure as the weight shifted. I still get trouble breathing. I think a part of me is still stuck there. It stayed in my vehicle. I had moved to the neighborhood looking for a fresh start. Just me, my cat, and the quiet, suburban streets. After the breakup, I needed to get away from everything familiar, the echoes of the past that seemed to follow me wherever I went. The house I found was a modest one, with white trim and a small garden, nestled in a tree-lined street where every house looked like it belonged in a picture frame. The kind of place that whispered, peaceful and safe. I thought it would be just the thing to help me recover, but I should have known that sometimes peace comes with a price. My first few days were mostly uneventful. I unpacked, arranged the furniture in the living room, and wandered around the neighborhood, taking in the quiet, the stillness. That's when I first met Sarah. She lived in the house next door, a large, well-maintained property with a garden that looked like something out of a magazine. I noticed her in the driveway, bent over, pruning her roses. Her smile was wide, almost too wide, and she looked up at me like she'd been waiting for me. "Hi, you must be Megan, the new neighbor." Her voice was bubbly, warm, with just a touch of forced enthusiasm. "I'm Sarah. I live next door." I smiled, figuring I had just met someone who was genuinely friendly. She invited me over for coffee the next day, and we spent hours talking. At first, I enjoyed the conversation. It was nice to have someone to talk to, especially since the quiet of the house started to feel a bit too overwhelming. Sarah was in her 30s, with a perpetual air of cheerfulness that, at the time, felt comforting. She told me about her life, her job, and how she'd been living in the neighborhood for years. She also mentioned how she enjoyed meeting new people, which seemed to explain why she was so eager to chat. As days went by, Sarah's visits became more frequent. She showed up uninvited sometimes, just to check in or bring over a casserole or flowers. I didn't mind at first. It was a small town after all, and I figured she was just a friendly, helpful person. But slowly, I began to feel something shift, like a weight pressing down on me. I felt smothered, like I couldn't breathe without her there, hovering, always wanting to be part of my life. I remember one evening, after a long day of unpacking, I finally settled into the couch with a glass of wine. I had planned to relax in silence, just me and my thoughts. But no sooner had I turned on the TV when the doorbell rang. Sarah stood there with a jar of homemade jam, her smile wide as ever. "I thought you might like this," she said, holding the jar out to me as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I made it this morning. You're the new neighbor after all. I just wanted to make sure you feel welcome." I took the jar, and for a moment, I felt guilty for feeling irritated. But deep down, something told me that Sarah wasn't just being friendly. There was something about her that didn't sit right. I smiled politely and invited her in for a few minutes, but the whole time I felt like I was being watched. It was like she was studying me, reading me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer just a neighbor to her. I was something else, something she wanted to keep close, like a possession. As Sarah left that night, I watched her walk back to her house with her usual purposeful stride. And that was when I first noticed something odd. Her house, despite being so meticulously kept, felt off. It was too perfect, too clean, like it was a facade she was desperately trying to maintain. Even the curtains in her windows were always drawn, as if to keep the world from looking inside. I didn't know why, but the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. Something about Sarah, something about the way she had inserted herself into my life, didn't sit right with me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The days dragged on, and Sarah's presence became a constant in my life. At first, I had thought her sudden appearances were just the quirks of a lonely person, someone who wanted to make sure I felt at home. But as time passed, her behavior started to seem more calculated, deliberate. There was an intensity to her actions now, a kind of fixation that I couldn't ignore. I'd be in the middle of a quiet evening, reading or watching TV, and there she was again, standing at my door with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She'd bring little gifts, always something that seemed just a bit too personal. Candles that smelled exactly like the ones I'd mentioned liking, or new plants for my windowsill. Each gift, each visit, felt like a subtle intrusion into my space. The weirdest part was how she always seemed to know exactly when I needed her. It wasn't that I'd called for her or even asked for anything. But no matter what, Sarah always showed up when things were quietest. The times when I should have been left to my own thoughts, she'd come knocking, wanting to chat, or simply stand in the doorway and watch me. One evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to clear my head. I had just reached the end of the block when I noticed Sarah's house again. There was something about the windows that caught my attention. They weren't just closed, as I'd thought before. They were sealed tight, like something inside had to stay hidden. I tried to ignore the thought, but my curiosity kept tugging at me. The next day, I found myself standing outside Sarah's house, staring up at the large, square windows. It was a beautiful house, but there was something unsettling about the way it stood there, almost too perfect. The front door was always locked, and the windows always closed, no matter the time of day. I never saw anyone come or go, except for Sarah. I had a strange thought then. Maybe she wasn't just hiding something. Maybe she was hiding herself. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, the sound of Sarah's quiet laughter echoing in my mind. She always laughed like everything was fine, like nothing was wrong, but there was something in her eyes, a darkness that never quite matched the brightness of her smile. I finally decided to investigate. It wasn't a rational decision, but I couldn't ignore the pull any longer. I waited until midnight, the house silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. The moonlight filtered in through the curtains, casting shadows on the walls. I grabbed my coat, telling myself that I was just going for a walk, nothing more. But as I stood by my front door, a sense of urgency flooded over me. Something told me that tonight would be different. I took a deep breath and walked across the street, careful not to make any noise. The house looked even darker now, its windows like blank eyes watching me as I approached. The quietness of the neighborhood pressed in on me, and I felt as if I were doing something wrong, something I couldn't take back. But the pull was too strong. I had to know what was inside. I crept around the side of Sarah's house, moving slowly to avoid being seen. There was a narrow path leading to the back, overgrown with ivy and weeds. I felt my heart race as I reached the back door, which stood slightly ajar. I had no idea why she would leave it open, but it didn't matter. I slipped inside. The house smelled musty, like it hadn't been opened to the air in years. I made my way through the dark hallway, trying not to make a sound. The air grew colder the further I went, and the walls seemed to close in on me. My fingers brushed over the wallpaper, rough and old, as I made my way down the hall toward the stairs. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I pressed on. The house felt wrong, and I had to find out why. As I crept further into Sarah's house, the silence pressed against me like a living thing. Each step was a gamble. Would the floor creak? Would she hear me? But the house remained eerily still, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something. The light from the hallway barely reached the stairs as I ascended, one hand gripping the railing for support. Every inch of this place felt like it was suffocating me, but I couldn't turn back now. The second floor was just as unsettling as the first. The hall was narrow, with rooms that stretched back into darkness. I tiptoed past each door, peering into the rooms as I went. The first few were empty, save for a few pieces of antique furniture, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creep in as I moved further down the hall. Then I came to a door that was slightly ajar, and I froze. The room beyond was a study of some sort, shelves crammed with books I didn't recognize and old photographs pinned to the walls. But it wasn't the books or the photos that stopped me in my tracks. No, it was the smell. The pungent, metallic odor that filled the air. Something sharp and unpleasant. I couldn't put my finger on what it was, but it made my stomach turn. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was too quiet, but then I heard it. The faintest whisper like a breath on the wind. The sound came from behind one of the large cabinets. My curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled open the cabinet door, revealing a small, hidden space behind it. I gasped. There, in the dim light, were dozens of photos pinned to the wall. Each photo was of me, taken from various angles from different times, and the thing that chilled me to my core was how she'd captured me in places I thought were private. At my window, in my backyard, walking down the street. There was even one where I was laughing at the coffee shop, completely unaware that I was being watched. I stumbled back, my mind racing. How had she gotten these? How long had she been watching me? The room felt like it was closing in on me, and I could barely breathe as I looked at the photos, each one a silent testament to her obsession. I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. How could someone do this? And then I heard it again. The sound of whispering, soft but growing louder. It came from beneath the floorboards, an eerie scraping sound, like something scratching against wood. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. I had to get out. This was too much. But then something caught my eye. A door, almost hidden in the corner of the room, was cracked open just enough to reveal a dim light coming from within. My feet moved before my brain could stop them, and I found myself walking toward the door. I had to know what was behind it. What had Sarah been hiding? I pushed the door open. The basement stairs loomed before me, a dark, narrow passage that seemed to drop into the earth itself. The air was thick with the smell of dampness, and I could feel my heart racing in my chest. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, but then I heard the sound again. The whispering, the scraping, but now it was louder, more frantic. I had no choice. I had to see it for myself. The stairs creaked beneath my weight as I descended, the darkness swallowing me whole. Each step took me deeper into the pit, and the farther I went, the more the atmosphere shifted. It was as though the very air in the basement was charged with something electric, something wrong. I could feel the hairs on my arms stand up, and my breath came in shallow gasps. At the bottom of the stairs, the dim light revealed a room. Small, cramped, with a low ceiling. In the center of the room, a large metal cage sat against the far wall, and inside it I saw something. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. A grotesque figure, half human, half beast, lay in the cage, its eyes wide open, unblinking, staring directly at me. The creature's skin was pale and stretched thin, its body covered in patchy, matted hair. It hissed at me, a sound so chilling that I almost stumbled backward in fear. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing, but it was impossible. The whispering, the scratching, all of it had led me here. To this creature, this monstrosity that Sarah had been keeping. And then I heard her voice, soft and calm, as if nothing were wrong. "You shouldn't have come down here, Megan." I froze, my breath caught in my throat as Sarah's voice echoed in the small basement. My body felt like stone, unable to move. How long had she been standing there watching me? I couldn't tear my eyes away from the creature in the cage, its eyes still fixed on me, its presence suffocating the air. The tension between Sarah and me felt thick, unbearable, like the moment before a storm breaks. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Sarah stood just inside the doorway, her face calm, almost serene. There was no hint of panic or surprise in her expression, as though she had expected me to find this place all along. Her eyes were locked onto mine, but they were different. Cold, calculating, like the eyes of a predator watching its prey. "I knew you'd find it eventually," she said, her voice soft, almost like she was trying to soothe me. You always had to go snooping around, didn't you? Why? I whispered, the word barely escaping my lips. Why are you doing this? What is that thing? Sarah's smile never wavered. She stepped closer, her shoes tapping softly against the concrete floor, but her eyes never left mine. You wouldn't understand, Megan. You never did, but that's okay. She gestured toward the creature in the cage, her hand sweeping through the air like she was presenting a masterpiece. This is my family. This is what I've been working toward. I shook my head, the words not making sense, yet they rang in my ears with a chilling clarity. Your family? That thing is not a family, Sarah. It's a monster. Her expression darkened for a moment, the smile faltering before it returned more controlled. A monster? She repeated, her voice low and full of amusement. No, it's not a monster. It's a gift. It's something ancient, something powerful. I've been taking care of it for years. Feeding it, nurturing it, keeping it hidden, waiting for the right time. She paused, her gaze flicking briefly toward the creature in the cage. And now, Megan, it's time for you to join us. The room seemed to grow colder as she spoke. The creature in the cage let out a low growl, its eyes narrowing as it shifted, restless. I could feel its gaze on me, as if it were weighing my very soul. My stomach churned, a mixture of fear and disgust flooding me. Join you, I repeated, my voice trembling. What do you mean by that? What have you done to me? Sarah's smile widened. I've been watching you for months, Megan. I've been studying you, learning about you. Every little detail. Your habits, your fears, your weaknesses. Her eyes glinted with an unsettling intensity. You're perfect. You're exactly what we need. I took a step back, my mind racing to make sense of everything. What are you talking about? You're insane. Sarah's expression hardened, her patience clearly wearing thin. No, Megan, you just don't understand yet. You will. You'll see what I've been building. You'll see how perfect everything is once you become part of the family. I glanced at the creature, my heart sinking in my chest. It was no longer just a terrifying figure in a cage. It was part of this twisted reality Sarah had created. My thoughts spiraled, fear clawing at my insides. I needed to get out of here. I had to escape before it was too late. Listen to me, Sarah, I said, my voice shaking with desperation. You're sick. You need help. You can't keep doing this. You can't. Before I could finish my sentence, Sarah raised a hand, silencing me. Her gaze flickered to the creature in the cage again, and then back to me. You think I'm sick, Megan. You think this is wrong. You don't even know what real power is. This creature. It's not just a pet. It's a part of me, part of my purpose, and soon you'll be too. The room seemed to close in on me. I needed a plan, a way out, but my mind was spinning. There was no way I could take Sarah on by myself. Not with that thing in the cage, watching me like a hawk. I glanced around, looking for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing but old furniture and shelves of junk. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, the pressure building as Sarah's words sank in. Please, Sarah, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Let me go. I won't tell anyone. Just let me leave. Her smile twisted into something darker, more calculating. I can't let you go, Megan. Not now. Not when you're so close to understanding. You'll be a part of this family, whether you want to be or not. With a sudden movement, she stepped forward, reaching for me. But before she could grab me, the creature in the cage let out an ear-splitting screech, causing both Sarah and me to freeze in place. My heart skipped a beat, and I looked at the cage, only to find the bars rattling, the creature's form shifting violently inside. It was no longer in its cage. It had broken free. The basement door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged through my veins as I turned to face the door, desperately pushing against it with my hands. But the door was locked. There was no way out. My breath quickened, and I could hear Sarah's footsteps moving closer, her shadow creeping up behind me like an inescapable nightmare. I spun around, my pulse racing, searching for any way to defend myself. The creature, no, the thing, was out of its cage. It was no longer the grotesque, motionless shape that I had seen earlier. Now it was a hulking, deformed figure, its movements jerky, but with an unnatural speed. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, and its eyes burned with a predatory hunger. It was as if the air itself had turned toxic, thick with a sense of malice that crawled under my skin. Sarah, I gasped, my voice trembling with terror. "What the hell have you done?" She didn't respond. Her cold, emotionless stare locked onto me, and I saw the faintest hint of satisfaction in her eyes. "It's beautiful, isn't it? You're starting to understand now, Megan. This is all part of the plan." The creature took another step forward, its claws scraping against the concrete floor. It was almost to me. My heart hammered against my chest as I stumbled back, desperate to create distance between us. I scanned the room frantically, my mind struggling to form a coherent thought. My eyes landed on a rusted pipe near the far wall, and instinct kicked in. I rushed toward it, grabbing the pipe with both hands and pulling it free from the wall. My grip tightened around the cold metal as I turned back to face Sarah and the creature. The thing was now almost on top of me, its eyes glowing with hunger. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I raised the pipe, ready to defend myself, but I knew it wouldn't be enough to stop it. "Stay back," I yelled, my voice raw with fear, though I wasn't sure who I was warning. Sarah or the creature. "I'll fight you, I swear." Sarah didn't flinch. In fact, she seemed to enjoy my panic. "You can't fight it, Megan. You're too weak. You've always been weak." The creature lunged, its powerful legs propelling it toward me faster than I could react. I swung the pipe, but it was too slow. The creature knocked it from my hands with ease, sending it crashing to the ground. It let out a growl, the sound vibrating through my bones. I scrambled backward, my heart racing. This was it. There was no way out, no way to survive. The creature's breath was hot and foul, its claws glinting in the dim light. I could feel the floor beneath me tremble as it stalked closer, its body bending unnaturally as it moved. I knew I had mere seconds before it reached me. But then, a voice. Sarah's voice, cut through the chaos. "Enough." The creature froze in place. I turned to look at Sarah, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. She stood in the doorway, her eyes glowing with an almost eerie intensity. Her voice, though calm, was filled with a strange, commanding authority. "Go back to the cage," Sarah said, her tone low but filled with power. "Now." I watched in shock as the creature hesitated, its movements slowing, as if it was processing her command. And then, just as suddenly as it had charged toward me, it turned away, moving back toward the cage, its massive body shifting with unnatural grace. "What the hell is going on?" I whispered, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. "Why did it listen to you?" Sarah smiled, a cruel, twisted grin that sent chills down my spine. "I've spent years training it. It listens to me because it knows I am its creator. I am the one who has given it life. And now, it's time for you to join us." I shook my head, disbelief mixing with dread. "No, Sarah, I won't. I'll never join you." Sarah's eyes darkened. "You don't have a choice, Megan. You never did." Before I could respond, she stepped forward, closing the distance between us. She raised her hand, and I felt a sharp, sudden pain shoot through my chest. I gasped, my knees buckling beneath me as I staggered back. It was as if her very presence was suffocating me, draining me of my strength. "You'll be just like the others," she murmured, her voice like ice. "A part of my family. Forever." With everything I had left, I staggered to my feet. I had to get out. I couldn't let Sarah win. But as I turned to make a run for the stairs, I was stopped dead in my tracks by a sudden force that pinned me to the floor. The creature had come back. It was standing above me, its massive, clawed hands pressing me down, its face inches from mine. I could feel its breath on my skin, hot and rancid, as its teeth glinted in the dim light. "Please," I whispered, my voice trembling, "don't." But it didn't listen. It didn't need to. The last thing I heard was Sarah's voice, soft and satisfied. "It's over, Megan. You're mine now." I closed my eyes, knowing that there was no escape. The darkness swallowed me whole. I woke to the sound of heavy footsteps, my body aching as if it had been beaten into submission. My head throbbed and my vision was blurred. The oppressive weight on my chest made it difficult to breathe, but I pushed through, forcing my eyes open. The room around me was dim, but I could make out the shapes of the basement walls, the same ones I had been in earlier. The creature was gone. I slowly sat up, disoriented, my hands reaching out for anything to steady myself. My mind struggled to piece together the events that had led to this moment. Sarah had been there, the creature, the overwhelming terror that had nearly consumed me. How had I survived? I looked around and realized I was alone. The basement was eerily silent now. The faint smell of decay lingered in the air, but it wasn't as thick as before. My heart was still racing, and fear gnawed at my insides, but there was no time to dwell on it. The door to the basement creaked open, and I froze. I expected Sarah to walk in, but instead it was someone else. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the sheriff's uniform. His eyes widened when he saw me sitting on the floor, dazed but alive. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gruff but filled with concern. He rushed over to me, kneeling down to help me up. "We got the call. You're safe now." "The call," I croaked, my throat dry. "What happened? Where's Sarah? The creature? What happened to it?" The sheriff didn't answer right away, but his face grew darker. He helped me stand, guiding me to the stairs. "Let's get you out of here first. We'll talk once you're out of this place." I followed him, the weight of my exhaustion bearing down on me with each step. The stairs creaked under our weight as we ascended, and the further we climbed, the less I could feel the presence of Sarah. The fear that had gripped me now felt like a distant memory. When we reached the top of the stairs, I looked around, expecting to see more officers or evidence of the chaos I'd experienced. But there was nothing. The house was quiet, too quiet. "Where is everyone?" I asked, confusion creeping into my voice. "They're clearing the house," the sheriff replied, his expression grim. "Sarah's gone. We've already taken care of the creature. It won't hurt anyone again." I shook my head, disbelief settling in my stomach. "You killed it?" He nodded slowly. "It wasn't alive the way you or I are. What Sarah had created. It wasn't human. It was a thing that shouldn't have been allowed to live." "But how did you know?" I asked, still reeling. "How did you find us?" The sheriff hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "We'd been investigating Sarah for a while. We had our suspicions, but no one could have imagined the full extent of her obsession. When we got the tip-off, we moved fast." "Who tipped you off?" I pressed, my mind racing to make sense of everything. "That's something you don't need to worry about right now," he said, avoiding my gaze. "What matters is that you're safe. We've got everything under control." But I wasn't sure that was true. The fear hadn't left me entirely. Something still didn't sit right. I hadn't just been a victim in this twisted game. Something deeper, darker, was at play. "You said Sarah was gone," I whispered. "But what does that mean? Is she—" "She's been arrested," the sheriff interrupted, his voice hardening. "But that doesn't explain what she was really up to. There's more to this than just one obsessed woman. We'll get to the bottom of it." The sheriff's words barely made sense to me, but the tension in the room was palpable. He led me to the front door, where I could see the flashing lights of police cars parked outside, casting their harsh glow across the yard. Officers were moving in and out of the house, taking notes and collecting evidence. I could feel my legs giving way beneath me, but the sheriff steadied me, helping me into a waiting patrol car. As the door closed behind me, I sank back into the seat, the weight of everything that had happened pressing on me. I never thought I'd end up in a place like this. Out in the middle of nowhere, where the only thing between me and total silence was the wind pushing through the trees. But I needed the job. The ad had been simple. Caretaker needed for an off-season lodge. Room and board provided. Must be comfortable with solitude. It wasn't exactly a dream position, but after months of rejection letters and dwindling savings, I didn't have the luxury of choice. So I packed up and drove out to Black Hollow Lodge, a massive structure built decades ago, tucked deep into the Pennsylvania wilderness. The place had been a retreat once, catering to artists and wealthy eccentrics who wanted to commune with nature. But those days were long gone. Now it sat empty most of the year, its windows dark and its halls silent. I met the owner, a man named Richard Calloway, just before sunset. He was old, with watery eyes and a thin, precise voice. "Not much to it," he told me, leading me through the main hall. "Keep the place clean. Make sure no pipes burst. The generator's a little temperamental, so be mindful of that." He handed me a ring of heavy keys. "No one comes up here in the winter. No one's supposed to." That last part stuck with me. Not expected, but supposed to. I almost asked what he meant, but Calloway had already started for the door, eager to leave before night fell. I watched as his car disappeared down the only road leading in or out, leaving me alone with the wind and the sprawling, empty lodge. The first night was uneventful. I moved through the grand halls, running my fingers over the dust-coated banisters, flipping light switches just to see if they still worked. There was something surreal about being the only person in a space that had once been alive with laughter and conversation. The air smelled stale, and every footstep echoed like I wasn't really alone. By the second night, I started noticing small things. A chair that had been slightly pulled out from the dining table. A door at the end of the hall that creaked open just a little wider than I remembered. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was letting the isolation get to me. But then I found something I couldn't explain. Something that sent a shiver up my spine. In the hallway near my room, written in the dust on the mirror, were 3 words. Let me out. I stared at the words on the mirror, my breath clouding the glass. Let me out. The letters had been traced through the dust, uneven and jagged, like they'd been scrawled in haste. My first instinct was to wipe them away, pretend I hadn't seen them. But my hand hovered inches from the glass, a deep, sinking feeling settling in my stomach. I was alone. Or at least, I was supposed to be. I forced myself to check the doors, the windows. Everything was locked. The only way in or out was the long, winding road I'd watched Calloway drive down yesterday. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was an old message left by a previous caretaker. Maybe the dust had shifted, revealing something that had been there for years. But deep down, I didn't believe that. That night, as I lay in bed, I started hearing the noises. It was faint at first, a light tapping sound, like tree branches scratching against the windows. But as the hours dragged on, the tapping grew more insistent. A steady, rhythmic scratching. And it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the walls. I sat up, heart hammering. The scratching moved, shifting from one side of the room to the other, pausing, then starting up again closer to my bed. Someone, was in there. I grabbed my flashlight and got out of bed, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The scratching stopped the second I moved. I pressed my ear against the wall, holding my breath. Silence. Just when I started to convince myself I'd imagined it, a whisper slithered through the dark. I see you. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair in my panic. The flashlight trembled in my grip as I shone it around the room. Nothing. No shadows, no movement. Just my own ragged breathing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the room, back against the wall, staring at the darkness. The scratching never returned. But as dawn broke, I found something new. A long, thin crack running along the baseboard, just wide enough to slip a finger inside. And something had been pushed through from the other side. A tooth. I didn't touch it. The small, yellow tooth sat on the floor like it had been placed there deliberately, waiting for me to acknowledge it. My stomach twisted as I crouched down, the flashlight's beam shaking as I brought it closer. It was real. No doubt about it. A human tooth. I backed away, my mind scrambling for explanations that didn't involve someone watching me from inside the walls. Maybe it had fallen from an old rat nest. Maybe some kid had lost it decades ago, and it had somehow worked its way out of the wood. But I didn't believe that. Instead of running, I grabbed a screwdriver from the kitchen and wedged it into the crack. The wood groaned as I pried the baseboard loose, revealing a narrow, dark gap. The stench of damp rot and something sour hit me immediately. I coughed, waving a hand in front of my nose, but I didn't stop. I widened the gap just enough to fit my flashlight inside. And that's when I saw it. A small tunnel. A space barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, leading deeper into the walls. My breath hitched. Something had been in there. The dust was disturbed, pushed aside by movement. Crumpled food wrappers, old and brittle, were shoved into the corners. Scratches lined the wood. Deep grooves where fingernails had dug in. My vision blurred for a second, my brain refusing to accept what I was seeing. Someone had lived in there. I yanked my flashlight back and scrambled away, heart pounding. The walls felt too close, the house suddenly too small. I needed to leave, get out, tell Calloway I was done with this place. But then I heard it. A slow, deliberate inhale. Not from the tunnel. From behind me. I turned, pulse hammering so hard I thought I'd pass out. The closet door was open, and a pair of eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at me from the darkness inside. I couldn't move. My body locked up, my breath caught somewhere between my throat and my lungs. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't shift or dart away like a startled animal. They just stared. Then, slowly, agonizingly slow, the door creaked open wider. A shape unfurled from the darkness. Long limbs, impossibly thin, like a person stretched too far. A head tilted at an unnatural angle, joints stiff as it stepped forward, bare feet soundless against the wooden floor. The flashlight trembled in my grip. I wanted to scream, run, do something, but all I could do was stare back, locked in place like an animal caught in a trap. The figure took another step, and then it smiled. A slow, cracking grin that split its face like an old wound reopening. The breath I'd been holding finally escaped in a ragged gasp. My legs snapped free from their paralysis, and I bolted. I didn't think, didn't plan, just ran. Down the hallway toward the front door. But the floor shifted beneath me. Something underneath the boards moved. A hollow thump, a scraping sound like hands dragging along the wood from inside. My ankle caught on the uneven floor, and I crashed forward, my flashlight clattering away. I rolled onto my back, scrambling to push myself up. But the thing was already there. It was faster than it had any right to be. It crawled out of the closet on all fours, moving like a spider, its head too low, arms bending at unnatural angles. My stomach flipped as I scrambled backward. Who? Who are you? My voice was barely a whisper. The thing tilted its head, as if considering the question. And then it answered. I live here. The voice was wrong. Scratchy and dry, like dead leaves rustling together. My hands found the fallen flashlight, fingers shaking as I raised it again. The beam landed on its face. It wasn't just a stranger. It was Mr. Webb, or what was left of him. His skin hung loose, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. His clothes, tattered and stained, clung to his skeletal frame. But worst of all was his mouth. That awful, stretching smile, exposing jagged teeth. Some missing, some too sharp. He took another step closer, and I did the only thing I could. I threw the flashlight at his face and ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I did, I might see him gaining on me, those two long limbs carrying him across the floor in a way no human should move. My feet pounded against the wooden planks, breath ragged as I sprinted down the hallway. The door. I needed to get to the front door. But as I reached for the knob, something slammed against the wall behind me. The impact rattled the old house, and a deep, scraping noise followed, like nails dragging along the wood. I twisted the knob. It wouldn't budge. Locked. No. Then I heard it. The sound of floorboards creaking, right above me. I tilted my head up. A thin, bony hand was reaching through a vent in the ceiling. Long fingers writhing, stretching toward me like they had a mind of their own. I stumbled back, my spine hitting the wall. My mind raced. There had to be another way out. The windows. The basement. I turned and ran, tearing through the house, past the kitchen, down the stairs. The air grew colder the deeper I went, the musty scent of old wood thick in my lungs. The basement door groaned as I pushed it open, the darkness inside swallowing me whole. I reached for the light switch. Nothing. The bulb overhead flickered once, then died. A sound. Something shifting in the shadows. I wasn't alone down here. I fumbled in the dark, hands outstretched, searching for anything I could use. My fingers brushed against a toolbox, and I grabbed the first thing I found. A rusted hammer. My pulse pounded in my ears as I backed against the wall, forcing myself to stay still, to listen. Silence. And then, tap, tap, tap. Not from the stairs. Not from the walls. But from inside them. A whisper followed, curling through the dark. I never left. Something slammed into me from behind, and the world turned to black. I woke to darkness. A thick, suffocating kind. My head throbbed, my thoughts slipping in and out of focus like a radio struggling to find a signal. I was lying on something hard, my cheek pressed against rough wood. Then I heard it. Breathing. Slow, steady, deliberate. Not mine. I pushed up on shaky arms, my fingers searching blindly. Wood. Narrow space. A wall. I wasn't just in the basement anymore. I was inside the walls. A sharp inhale. Too close. The sound of fabric shifting, bare feet brushing against wood. He was here, in this space with me. I held my breath, forcing my body to go still. My eyes adjusted just enough to make out the faintest outline of movement ahead. Mr. Webb, hunched and twisted, his gaunt face barely visible in the dim light filtering through a vent. He was watching me, waiting. I gripped the hammer tighter. Think, Grace. Think. Then I remembered. The gas line. Slowly, I shifted, inching my way through the narrow passage. Webb stayed still, his head tilting slightly, as if he could hear my heartbeat rattling against my ribs. I bit down on the inside of my cheek to keep from making a sound. There, the gas pipe. I reached out, fingers brushing cold metal, feeling for the valve. Webb moved. A sharp hiss of breath. He lunged. I twisted the valve open. The scent of gas hit me immediately, sharp and nauseating. Webb snarled, his thin hands grabbing at my wrist, fingers digging into my skin like claws. I swung the hammer. Metal met flesh with a sickening crack. He reeled back, hissing through his teeth. I didn't wait. I scrambled toward the basement's opening, shoving at a loose panel of wood, squeezing through as the passage filled with gas. I burst into the open space, lungs burning, ears ringing. My hands fumbled through my pocket. The matchbook. Webb's voice slithered from the dark. You can't leave me, Grace. I struck a match. The flame flickered once. Then I tossed it in. The explosion ripped through the walls, the blast throwing me forward as fire erupted behind me. I hit the ground hard, rolling, coughing. Smoke filled the house, curling along the ceiling like fingers grasping for something unseen. Then the screams started. High-pitched, inhuman wails echoing through the walls as the fire consumed everything inside them. I stumbled to my feet, crashing toward the front door. This time, it opened. I ran. By the time the fire trucks arrived, the house was already collapsing. The walls caved in, flames licking hungrily at the remains. And yet, no sign of Webb. No body pulled from the wreckage. Days later, as Ethan and I packed to leave town, I found myself staring at the charred remains of the house one last time. The basement had caved in completely, nothing but blackened rubble where the floor used to be. Almost. One section stood out. A raised piece of the foundation, almost like a trapdoor. It was open, and Webb was nowhere to be found. I think my neighbor is going to kill me. 3 months ago, someone strange moved into the apartment next to mine. I've lived in this apartment for about a year, and I always thought it was a safe and comfortable place to live. It's the kind of place where parents let their kids play outside after school and neighbors are always willing to lend a hand. I've always lived a boring life. Ever since getting out of school and moving out on my own, it's always the same day in and day out. I wake up to the dreadful screeches of my alarm clock, already exhausted. I go through the mundane morning routine of brewing coffee when I'm still half asleep, and doing the bare minimum to look presentable and keep up with personal hygiene. I go from my dull, boring apartment room to an even more dull and boring office job, where I spend 90% of the time playing solitaire or something on my computer. I go home feeling drained, and God forbid I have to run any errands before I can go home and lay on the couch to watch mind-numbing TV shows while eating whatever leftovers I have in the fridge. Day after day, the cycle just repeats. There's no denying how much of a recluse I am. I almost embrace it. So having apartment 106 at the end of the hall, with no one occupying the one next door, was ideal to me. Without voices or music or other sounds being heard through the thin walls, I felt like I was tucked away in my own quiet corner, which is comforting to an introvert like myself. One day after another boring shift, I noticed someone new had moved into the apartment next to mine, apartment 105. I saw him as I turned the corner to my hallway. He slipped a key from his pocket, unlocked the door, and walked straight into 105. I hadn't seen any moving trucks or anyone loading boxes as I headed out to work, but when I came home, I discovered I had a new neighbor already unpacking. It was like no one was there, and now they were, seemingly coming from nowhere. Other than that, nothing was strange at first, other than the fact of having someone I could bump into. I only saw him a handful of times since he moved in, and when I would, he seemed cold and lifeless, like someone in a dream. The people in my complex are fairly friendly, and will say hi when they see me and typically exchange pleasantries with each other. But it seemed no one even bothered to interact with him. They treated him like he wasn't even there, which was different from the generic welcome they gave me when I moved in. I guess it was mutual, as he seemed shut in and wouldn't even look at people passing by. Treat others how you'd like to be treated, I suppose. The oddity started only 5 days after he swiftly arrived. For the first 5 days, I only heard the sounds of shuffling, and I assumed he was moving around furniture and was just getting settled in the apartment, nothing out of the ordinary. The 5th day was when the music started. I was washing dishes when I heard the familiar tune reverberating through the walls for the first time. I froze standing in front of my sink. My eyes became glossed over as the reality of me, all grown up in my apartment, melted away into fuzzy memories of my childhood. I saw my mother dancing by herself in the living room, waltzing in and out of the soft golden sunlight that spilled through the windows like a spotlight. The nostalgia consumed me and made me feel sick. My hands began to tremble, and the loud crashing of the bowl that slipped out of my hands and hit the sink startled me enough to jolt me back to the present. The song I heard being muffled through the walls was a song my mother would play a lot when I was a child. "It's Been a Long, Long Time" by Kitty Callan. The song was bittersweet, reminding me of the short time I spent with her, but also reminding me that she's gone now. The music would start playing at the same time every day, right when I would settle in after work. I kinda liked it at first, as it had brought up fond and warm memories I had hidden away from myself and didn't resurface until I heard the song again. It felt warm to remember her, to come to terms with loss and grief. Every day, I heard it faintly play through the walls multiple times over, and the warm effect it had on me began to fade. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared and darkness overtook as night approached, the music would still play. It would only play 3 times at night. I thought it was odd, playing the same song at the same times over and over, but I wouldn't be surprised if people considered me to be a fairly odd man, so guess I have no room to speak. It wasn't loud enough to keep me from sleeping, and I'm not the type to confront him about it. It was when the music became eerily distorted, was when I started getting scared. It was another dull, boring night after another long day at work. I got home, pulled my clothes off, and threw them in the same pile in the corner I always do. I plop onto the couch and turn on the TV, and like clockwork the music starts. This time, those sentimental and wistful memories didn't flash behind my eyelids. This time, it had the same flat effect on me as everything else did in my bland, monotonous surroundings. I reached for the remote and increased my volume to where I could barely hear the song. Now that the song was buried under the dramatic voices blaring through the TV speakers, I allowed myself to zone out and become consumed by whatever senseless drama was being fed to me on this reality TV show. I dozed off and was jolted awake by some overly enthusiastic infomercial making empty promises. Still slumped on the couch and my eyelids half open, I switched off the TV. I was just about to let myself drift off to sleep again, but something wouldn't let me. Something kept me up, waiting for me to become aware of it again. That's when I realized that it didn't stop. My eyes darted to the clock on the microwave, the time 11:32 illuminated in green. This sent a chill through me. It always stopped after the 3rd loop, but 5 hours after it started and the song was still playing. I sat up, eyes wide open but staring at nothing in particular. I listened to the music intently, but it didn't sound the same it always had. It sounded like the record had been warped and scratched, like the record had been bent, producing a wobbly sound with more pronounced stutters. All my senses zeroed in on the sinister feeling of the distorted sounds, and that is when I heard it. A short burst of a petrifying scream cut off by the sound of a moist, meaty thud followed by silence. The world went quiet after that, the only sound being that dreadful deformed tune ringing in my ears. The sounds I heard that night must have put me in some sort of catatonic state. I couldn't even recall going through with my nightly routine. I must have been on autopilot or something. I snapped out of it as I was laying in bed, not tossing and turning, but laying completely still staring up at the ceiling. I contemplated calling the cops that night, but I couldn't work up the courage. I racked my brain of the possibilities of what I heard, or what I thought I heard. What if I was wrong? But also, what else could it have been? The thought of the gruesome events that could have occurred just a couple feet away from me that night, only separated by a shared wall, sent chills down my spine and left me paralyzed in fear. But I didn't want to look like an idiot and have the man living next to me thinking I'm a nosy, paranoid nuisance of a neighbor, so for the sake of sleep and my sanity, I convinced myself to brush it off. Maybe his TV speakers were better than mine, and I had mistaken a movie for real life. Shit, I even thought it could have all been in my head. I didn't want to think about it too much and scare myself, so I didn't. 2 weeks after that incident is when I saw him again. It was about 1 a.m. and I had left my lighter in my car, so I decided to go out and get it. And while I was walking out to my car, far in the back corner of the lot, I saw him dragging a large bag. It looked body-sized, leaving a red streak trailing the end of the black trash bag. I froze and strained my eyes to try and see better. Scared to move an inch, I held my breath as my eyes and brain scattered to make out the dark shapes and shadows I saw moving in the distance. The whole scene made me feel uneasy, the sounds of the bag dragging along the concrete, and the faint squelching sound as he lunged and gave the bag another pull. My eyes were still glued on him. I stood there paralyzed in fear. I started to feel lightheaded, and I lost my balance and stumbled backwards. He stopped, the bag slouched to the ground as his head slowly rotated toward me. Even in the thick darkness, it seemed as if his eyes pierced through it, pointing straight toward me. I turned around and started walking back to my apartment, feeling his eyes on the back of my head the entire time. I got back to my apartment and locked the bolt and the chain and tried going to sleep. Every time I would close my eyes, I could see his beady eyes staring back at me. There was no denying something was going on, but I couldn't bring myself to do anything about it. What if I got in trouble for taking so long? I just couldn't do it. The fear was too great, and I just wanted to forget about it. I didn't want to be right. The music started again after that night, the sound of the static overwhelming the music itself, the tempo much slower, giving it a haunting sound. When it would start playing, I just sat there and cried, waiting for it to be over. I heard a faint scratching noise on the wall bordering our rooms. It was faint, and I almost couldn't discern where it was coming from. The light scratching turned into a louder scraping sound, the sound of a sharp metal edge. The scraping turned into tearing as I could hear the wallpaper start to tear. At that point, I'm sitting there bawling and overwhelmed with fear and anxiety, knowing I'm next. I was happy to go to work the next morning, just happy to be away from him, somewhere he couldn't hurt me. I drove to work with an uneasy feeling. I felt like I was being watched. I almost crashed my car when I see him staring at me with the same glare, wearing the same greasy wife beater and stained jeans. He was on the side of the road, just staring like a predator stalking his prey. I finished up work and walked out of work uneasy. I checked my corners before fully exposing myself from them and sprinted to my car. I drove back home more anxious than usual, not knowing where he could have been. I finally made it back and parked as close to the hallway as I could, closing the distance between my room and the car. I felt tense and hyper-aware as I stepped out of my car and looked back to the spot I had seen him last night. A sense of relief came over me seeing he wasn't there, but that feeling soon turned to a crippling terror as my focus shifted to my car. I saw him sitting in the back seat of my car with a grin spanning from ear to ear. The disturbing sight of him made me jump, and I tripped over my own feet, stumbling to the ground but keeping my eyes on the top of his head. It's all I could see from the ground as I pushed my body closer and closer to the hallway, hearing my clothes tear and rip as it hooked onto the concrete. I made it to the hallway and could barely get back onto my feet, praying he wasn't going to charge me. I broke into a sprint, still trying to keep my balance. I made it to my door and started feeling for my keys. I checked each and every pocket and don't feel the sharp ridges of them. My heart was racing faster than it ever has. My keys must have fallen out of my pocket or something when I fell to the ground. I turned my head and the reflection of my keys caught my eye as I glared down the hall. Without thinking, I sprinted to the end of the hall and grabbed them. Once the car was in my view, I noticed he wasn't there anymore. I didn't waste any time getting back to my room barreling down the hall. I unlocked the door, got in my room, then shut and locked the door. The moment the last lock latches, he started pounding on my door, the noise echoing through my small apartment, sending shivers through my entire body. At this moment, I know I can't wait any longer. I didn't care if I was wrong about it. I needed to call the cops. I reached in my pocket and struggled to get it out while he was banging at my door. Once my phone was in my hand and I went to turn it off, my face went pale and my hands began to shake. My phone was dead. Without hesitation, knowing time wasn't on my side, I rushed to my room and put it on the charger. The second I plugged it in, the banging stopped and the music started. It was louder than ever, filling my ears with a haunting slow tune barely recognizable from the song I once loved. The melody of the song starts looping. As it loops faster, it got louder, turning into a droning noise as I hear a faint scream that grows in volume, piercing my ears and tickling my brain. I sat there shaking and crying. I felt the faint buzz of my phone coming back to life. I turned it on and started dialing 911. As soon as the dialing stopped and the operator picked up, I heard their voice asking me questions, but in my panicked state, I could not listen or comprehend their words. In the midst of all this chaos, I felt so overstimulated that my mind seemed empty, but so full and scattered at the same time, making it impossible for me to form any coherent thoughts, let alone sentences. A spew of frantic word vomit streamed out of my mouth, and I didn't care if what I said was comprehensible. I just remember screaming and pleading for help, begging for someone to come and save me, to make it all stop, take him away. The operator's staticky voice suddenly got drowned out as the banging resumed, seemingly coming from every wall, and the music became almost deafening. My hands began to tremble and my phone fell to the floor and slid across the room, making whatever the operator is saying completely inaudible now. I collapsed onto the ground, curling into a ball and pulling my knees tight to my chest, trying to make myself as small as possible. My thoughts were drowned out by the haunting music that swarmed my head until it felt like my skull was going to explode from the inside out. My nails dug into my scalp as I gave up screaming for help and silently cried. Everything stopped. Then the banging on the door resumed, but it wasn't the same as before. A wave of relief rushed over me when I heard, "Police, open the door." I gathered myself and ran to the door, frantically telling them what had just happened. I pointed to the room and told them, "He's in there." They nodded and told me to stay put. An officer sat with me, calming me down while they banged on his door. "Police, open up. We need to speak with you," they yelled through the door as they banged on it. I eagerly waited to hear a response. Silence. "We know you're in there. This is the police. Open the door and come out peacefully." Silence. "We've tried calling out to you, but there's been no response. For your safety and the safety of others, we are now preparing to enter the premises. Stand back and keep your hands visible," they said before they busted down the door. They swarmed the room with their guns drawn. I waited with an officer outside of the room. They came out of the room and reported that no one was inside. I glance inside myself and see that there is no furniture, no signs of anyone living there. The police contacted the landlord to get the name of the resident. Nothing came back, and they told me the apartment has been vacant for months. That happened a week ago. I decided to tell this story because the music started playing again, and I don't know what to do. Megan and Chris had dreamed of a quiet life for years. After years of city noise and relentless schedules, they finally found it. An old house nestled at the edge of a large forest in a sleepy, suburban town. The house, a modest two-story with faded white paint and a wraparound porch, seemed perfect. The price was right too, far below what they would have paid for something similar in the city. It felt like an answer to a prayer, a fresh start for their family, a place to raise their 2 children in peace. The previous owner, Mrs. Hargrave, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances a few months prior. The neighbors didn't say much about her, but there was an unsettling tension in the way they avoided the topic. Whispers circled about her odd behavior and the strange happenings that had been reported during her final years in the house. Some said she had been involved in something unnatural, but nothing concrete was ever confirmed. At first, Megan didn't pay much attention to the rumors. The house itself had a calming atmosphere. The creak of the wooden floors, the smell of dust and old furniture. It all added to its charm. It was everything she had wanted, quiet, secluded, and full of potential. For the first time in years, she felt like they had found their place. But then the night started to feel strange. It began subtly, almost like she was imagining it. A faint whistling, a soft sound that seemed to drift through the walls, coming and going like the wind. Megan dismissed it at first, assuming it was the house settling, or perhaps the breeze sneaking through the cracks in the old windows. But as the days passed, the sound persisted, growing more distinct with each night. It wasn't just the wind. It was a rhythm, a pattern, something deliberate. Megan mentioned it to Chris, but he shrugged it off. "It's just the house, Meg," he said, eyes glued to his phone as he settled into the couch after a long day at work. "Old places make weird noises." Still, Megan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The whistling wasn't random. It had a tone to it, almost like someone was trying to get her attention. And it wasn't just that. It was the silence that followed. There were moments, usually just after dusk, when the air seemed unnaturally still, as if even the woods around them had stopped breathing. The first time she heard the whistling again, she stood by the window, trying to pinpoint its source. The dark woods outside were nothing but a shadowy maze of trees, their twisted limbs barely visible in the moonlight. The sound came from there, she was sure of it. Deep within the forest, where no one ventured. It was distant, yet somehow close enough to feel personal, like it was waiting for her. The feeling gnawed at her the next few days, pulling at her every thought. What if it wasn't just the house settling? What if it was something else, something that had been there before they arrived? Something connected to Mrs. Hargrave. The curiosity gnawed at Megan more with each passing night. The whistling had become louder, clearer, and more urgent. It wasn't just some odd noise or the wind. It was deliberate. Someone, or something, was trying to get her attention. The question that kept echoing in her mind was, why? One evening, after Chris had gone to bed and the kids were fast asleep, Megan found herself standing by the window once more, staring into the dark forest beyond their backyard. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing, and the faint, rhythmic whistling drifted toward her like a call. It was impossible to ignore it any longer. With her heart racing, Megan grabbed her jacket, pulled on her shoes, and slipped out the back door, careful not to wake anyone. The night was cold, the air crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. As she made her way toward the woods, the sound grew louder, more distinct. Her steps quickened, almost as if the sound itself was urging her on. The trees swallowed her as she entered the woods, their thick branches blocking out most of the moonlight. The whistling was louder now, close enough that she could almost feel it vibrating in her chest. Megan's mind raced with questions, but she didn't stop to think. She had to know what was making the sound. It was like an invisible force was guiding her deeper into the woods, further than she had ever gone before. Her feet stumbled over roots and uneven ground, but she pressed on, driven by a strange mixture of fear and determination. The further she walked, the louder the whistling became, until it felt like it was all around her, closing in. The woods felt alive, and Megan couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her, that they knew she was coming. Finally, she came to a clearing. The trees parted, and there, standing just inside the circle of moonlight, was a figure. Megan froze. The figure was tall, its features obscured by the shadow of a large, wide-brimmed hat. The figure didn't move, but the whistling sound stopped as soon as she saw it. For a moment, everything was silent. "Who's there?" Megan called, her voice trembling, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head, as if sizing her up. Megan stepped forward, her breath shallow. "What is this?" she whispered, her eyes scanning the figure for any sign of recognition. It was then that the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," a voice, rough and low, said. Megan's stomach dropped. It was Mr. Thompson, the quiet neighbor who lived across the street. She hadn't recognized him at first. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, as though he had been waiting for her. He took a step toward her, his hand shaking. "I've been trying to protect you," he said, his voice strained. "This is bigger than you know. You're not supposed to be here." Before Megan could respond, he grabbed her wrist, pulling her away from the clearing and deeper into the woods. Megan's mind raced as Mr. Thompson led her deeper into the woods. She tried to pull away, but his grip was tight, his fingers digging into her skin. His urgency was palpable, and something about his frantic expression made her heart pound in her chest. She didn't know what she expected, but this wasn't it. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice shaky, but her curiosity was overpowering her fear. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes darting back and forth through the darkness. "You don't understand. You need to leave. Now, it's too late for you to turn back." His words sounded desperate, as though he were fighting against something much larger than himself. The further they walked, the denser the trees grew, until the path was nearly impassable. The air grew colder, the faintest mist clinging to the ground. Megan felt her breath catch in her throat, a strange pressure building in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone, that something was watching them, waiting. Finally, they reached a small clearing hidden deep in the woods. In the center stood a circle of stones, worn and ancient, surrounded by symbols that Megan didn't recognize. There was a strange stillness in the air, as if the forest itself had grown quiet, as though holding its breath. Megan's eyes widened as she took in the scene before her. The clearing felt wrong, unnatural. It was as if time itself had been warped here, the earth beneath her feet heavy with dark history. The symbols on the stones were crude, etched in a language that she could not decipher. But there was no mistaking the energy in the air. Something malevolent had been here. "This is where it all happens," Mr. Thompson said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. He let go of her wrist, his hand trembling as he pointed toward the center of the circle. "This is where they summon it." "Summon what?" Megan asked, her voice low, as she took a cautious step closer. The sense of dread was overwhelming, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the circle. "The Whistler," he said, as if the words themselves were a burden to speak. "It's an ancient being, something not of this world. We've been trying to communicate with it for years. The rituals, the whistling, it's all part of the process. We've almost succeeded." Megan's stomach twisted in horror. "You're saying you've been calling something that's not human?" Mr. Thompson nodded grimly. "It's not just us. The others in the neighborhood, they're part of it too. People come and go, but we've been here for decades, waiting for the right time. And that time is now." His eyes locked with hers. "You need to leave before it's too late." Megan felt a shiver run down her spine as she absorbed his words. The stories about Mrs. Hargrave, the disappearances, the strange happenings, it was all connected. But what was worse, she realized, was that she was standing in the heart of whatever this was. The Whistler was real, and whatever power it held, it was close to being unleashed. She needed to stop it. Megan's mind was spinning, her pulse quickening with every word Mr. Thompson uttered. The Whistler, a being of such power that it could shift the very fabric of reality. And the cult, this group, they had been building towards this moment for years, drawing closer to their goal. She could see it in their eyes, that fanaticism, the belief that they were on the cusp of something enormous, something dangerous. "What happens if you succeed?" Megan asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure she wanted to know, but she had to ask. Mr. Thompson's face grew even more solemn. "Chaos, destruction. The Whistler has the power to unravel the world around it, to bend time, space, and the very essence of life itself. It's not just a creature. It's a force we can't control." Megan's chest tightened, and she fought to steady her breath. She had to stop them. She had no choice. The town, her family, everyone she cared about was at risk. She could already feel the weight of what was to come pressing down on her. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the trees, breaking her out of her thoughts. She turned, scanning the dark woods around them. Mr. Thompson's eyes widened in alarm. "They're coming," he muttered, panic creeping into his voice. "You need to leave, Megan, now." But it was too late. From the shadows emerged figures. Silhouettes moving swiftly, gliding through the trees like phantoms. They wore long, dark robes, their faces obscured by hoods. The members of the cult. They had gathered, ready to complete the ritual. Megan's heart hammered in her chest as she took a step back. "I can't leave. Not now. I have to stop this." Mr. Thompson reached for her arm, but she pulled away. "You don't understand, Megan. They'll kill you if you try to stop it. They won't let anyone interfere." "I'm not leaving," Megan said firmly, her voice strong. "You may think you're controlling this, but I won't let you bring it into the world." As the robed figures closed in, Megan's gaze fell upon the circle of stones again. It was as if the ground itself was alive with a terrible energy vibrating under her feet. The air felt thick, charged with something sinister. In the center of the circle, a large stone altar stood, its surface cracked and worn from years of use. A strange symbol was carved into it, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Without thinking, Megan ran forward, hoping to disrupt whatever ritual was about to take place. She grabbed the nearest stone and tried to pull it from the circle, but as soon as her fingers touched it, a searing pain shot through her hand, forcing her to let go. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice desperate. "You have no idea what you're doing." One of the cult members stepped forward, his face obscured by the hood of his robe. "You should have stayed away, Megan," he said in a low, menacing tone. "You've interfered with things you can't comprehend. You've sealed your fate." The circle around them seemed to pulse, the symbols glowing brighter, and Megan realized with horror that it was too late to stop them. The air crackled with an unnatural energy, a palpable tension thickening as the cult members closed in on Megan. She could feel the force of the ritual, its power drawing her in, tugging at the edges of her mind. It was as if the very earth beneath her feet was shifting, bending, and she knew. Deep down, That the Whistler wasn't just a myth or a story. It was real. She backed away, her heart hammering in her chest as she scanned the group. Each robed figure was eerily still, their eyes locked on the altar, completely absorbed in the chant that was rising in volume, becoming more insistent. The symbols on the stones flickered, shimmering as though alive, and the air seemed to vibrate with an unseen force. Megan's legs were shaking, but she steadied herself, thinking quickly. If she couldn't break the ritual physically, she would have to disrupt it another way. She scanned her surroundings, searching for anything that could help her stop what was happening. Her eyes fell on a small, sharp rock on the ground, enough to break the chain. But the pain in her hand from before reminded her of the danger. Focus, she told herself, her breath coming out in shaky bursts. She could do this. She had to. Without another thought, she lunged toward the stone altar, her hands shaking as she grabbed the sharp rock. The chanting continued, a chorus of low voices that filled the woods with an otherworldly sound. She could feel it now, the presence of something ancient, something far too powerful for them to control. She swung the rock down onto the altar's surface. A deafening crack echoed through the woods, and the air around them seemed to split. The glowing symbols on the stones shattered, the light flickering violently, and for a brief moment, everything went dark. "No!" someone shouted from the group, but the voice was distant, muffled, as though coming from underwater. The world seemed to stretch, bend, and warp around her. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the wind whipped through the trees, rustling the leaves in a cacophony of whispers. Then, with a horrifying clarity, Megan saw it. The Whistler. It was nothing like she had imagined. No creature of flesh and bone, no beast of nightmares, but an embodiment of something far more terrifying. It wasn't just a physical presence, but a force, a void. She could feel it, pressing in on her, its shape an endless swirl of darkness, its form constantly shifting. It was as though the world itself was unraveling, fading into nothingness. "No," Megan gasped, stumbling back. The cult members had fallen silent, their eyes wide with fear as they watched the manifestation of the Whistler begin to take shape in the center of the circle. One of them, the leader, stepped forward, his voice trembling. It's here. We've summoned it." But it wasn't just there. It was everywhere. In every rustle of the trees, in the howl of the wind, in the very air they breathed. It was inescapable. A whispering, endless sound. A whistling that filled her ears, her mind, her soul. The Whistler reached out. No, it invaded, wrapping around her like tendrils, its presence suffocating. And with a final, earth-shattering screech, everything seemed to freeze. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the darkness began to pull back. The air cleared, the ground stopped shaking, and the forest was once again still. Megan stood frozen, her body trembling with the adrenaline of what had just happened. She turned slowly to look at the cult, who were now kneeling, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. The ritual had failed. But the question lingered. Had they truly stopped the Whistler, or had they simply triggered something far worse? Something that, even now, was beginning to shift back into the shadows, waiting for its next moment to emerge. The calm that followed the ritual felt unnatural, like the silence before a storm. Megan stood in the midst of the clearing, her mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. The Whistler, had it really been there? Or had it all been a terrible illusion, a trick of the mind? The air around her seemed clearer now, but the haunting whistling lingered in the back of her mind, like a melody she couldn't escape. The cult members remained motionless, their faces hollow and drained of color. Megan's breath came in shallow gasps as she approached them, her every instinct screaming at her to run, but she couldn't. Not yet. She had to understand what had happened. "Double, what was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and disbelief. The leader, a man with a gaunt face and trembling hands, finally spoke. "It was the Whistler. We failed." His voice was barely audible, barely a breath. "We tried to summon it, to control it, but we were never meant to. It's more than we thought, more than we could comprehend." Megan's heart pounded. "So, it's still out there. It didn't vanish, did it? It's just waiting for another chance." The leader shook his head, his eyes filled with terror. "We don't know. We don't know if it's gone or if it's just hiding. But we're not safe anymore. None of us are." Megan's gaze flickered to the rest of the group, their eyes vacant, lost. They were all consumed by the terror they had unleashed, unable to fully comprehend the consequences of their actions. And she knew. deep down, that their failure had only sealed their fate. As she backed away, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone, Megan's mind spun. What should she do now? The police would want answers. They would want to know everything. But how could she explain any of it? How could she make them understand something that even she wasn't sure about? Megan, a voice called out. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Mr. Thompson, his eyes wide and frantic as he stumbled toward her. He was breathing heavily, as if he had been running, and his clothes were torn, as if he had been caught in something far darker than just the woods. It's not over, he rasped. We didn't stop it. It was never supposed to be stopped. His face twisted in panic as he continued. You have to listen to me. The Whistler is more than a creature. It's a force, a manifestation of something ancient, and we can't control it. No one can. It's tied to this land, tied to this town. It can never be truly banished. Megan took a step back, feeling her stomach turn. Then why did you do it? Why did you try to summon it? Mr. Thompson's expression darkened. We thought we could harness its power. We thought we could control it, make it work for us. But we were wrong. So very wrong. Is it still out there? Megan's voice was hoarse, filled with dread. His lips trembled, and for a long moment he didn't answer. Then, his voice barely above a whisper, he said, It's waiting. Suddenly, a piercing whistle filled the air. Sharp, eerie, and unmistakable. It cut through the night, sending a shiver of dread down Megan's spine. The whistling sound was back. It was the same rhythmic tone she had heard before, but now it was louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the woods. It was all around them. And in that moment, Megan realized the horrible truth. The Whistler had never left. It had never been fully banished. It had only been waiting for the right moment to return. As the whistling grew louder, a wave of unease crashed over her, and she knew that no matter how hard she tried, she would never be able to escape it. The town, the forest, the very land they stood on was bound to the Whistler. Megan turned and ran, her legs pumping furiously, her breath ragged in her chest. Behind her, she could hear the whispers, somewhere in the dark, in the trees, in the wind, always just out of reach. The whistling echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the creature, the force that could never be truly stopped. No matter how hard she fought, no matter how much she wanted to leave it all behind, Megan knew that the Whistler was always waiting for the next chance to emerge from the shadows. And as she disappeared into the night, she understood the one undeniable truth. The Whistler was never gone. It was always here. The porch was tidy, a few flower pots vacant for the winter, and a small porch swing swayed gently in the wind. I must admit I was nervous as I turned to see the gravel road winding through the hills. My house was nearly 15 acres away from my closest neighbor, whose door I was standing in front of. After all, country life was new to me. I gently knocked on the door, the sound of a television coming from the other side. I waited a moment, but no one replied. As I turned, I saw an old Silverado, its red paint dusted with a light gray layer of gravel. I knocked again and waited patiently, but after a minute, I turned and began walking down the stairs. "Can I help you, fella?" I heard behind me as the door creaked open slightly. I turned back around to see a man with graying hair and a mustache peering out from behind horn-rimmed glasses. His eyes were a nearly wooden brown. "Hey there, my name is Jake," I said awkwardly. "I'm your new neighbor who moved in a couple of weeks ago, and I was just wondering if I could ask a favor." "And what might that be?" "I just ran out of sugar. I was wondering if I could borrow a cup just to use in my coffee." "Whole lot of sugar for a cup of coffee, I'd say," he replied with a slight, unapproving frown. "You be fixin' to bounce off the pastures with that much sugar." I chuckled nervously. "Well, I'm not going to use the whole thing on my coffee, just enough to get me by until I get to town to buy some." "You gonna bring me a cup and a half back?" he asked, stepping out onto the porch and locking eyes with me. Taller than me and built like a barrel, he wore thick denim jeans and an even thicker green and black flannel shirt. Confused by his response, I shrugged, searching for the right words. "A cup and a half?" "You know, it's charge and interest," he answered. "That's usually how stuff works when you borrow, you know." "Well, I guess borrowing was a poor choice of word," I corrected. "Could I have a cup of sugar, please?" The man grunted. He took a step forward, his gaze intense. I offered a gentle smile, hoping to disarm him. He tilted his head back and let out a hearty laugh that echoed around us. "I'm just joshing you, man," he chuckled. "Come on in and let's get you a cup of sugar. Can't have any man starting their day without coffee." "Thanks, sir," I replied. "What's your name, by the way?" "I'm Jebediah, but most people just call me Jeb," he responded, extending his hand for a firm handshake. "Pleasure to meet ya, Jake." "Likewise." "All right, come on in and let's get you fixed up," he said, gesturing for me to follow him inside. As I walked through the door, I noticed the wood-paneled walls were adorned with various hunting trophies, and the wooden furniture featured taxidermied wild animals. "Don't worry, they don't bite," Jeb chuckled, noticing my stare at his collection. "I've lived here almost my entire life." "You knew who owned my house before me?" "Yes, Sir Maud Bell. She was an odd duck." "Oh yeah?" "She wasn't very neighborly," Jeb replied as we walked into his meticulously clean kitchen, with 4 plates perfectly staged on the table. "We talked a few times, but I miss the days when people were neighborly, you know." "I wish I could say I did, but I'm from the city," I replied as he searched through a cabinet of labeled mason jars, pulling out one filled with white sugar. "Didn't even really know my neighbors." "That's a shame. I remember growing up, stuff like this happened all the time." "Like what?" "This right here, a neighbor coming over for a cup of sugar or asking for some eggs." "Yeah, never much of that where I grew up," I admitted. "Even growing up, I hardly knew my neighbors." "Simpler times, I guess," Jeb added as he filled a smaller mason jar with sugar for me, carefully avoiding spilling any on his counter. "So, what brought you to live down this way?" "Well, I work remotely, so I figured I'd get out of the city to somewhere more affordable and settle down." "What do you do?" "It project management." "Oh, one of them computer guys," Jeb chortled. "I don't know much about all that fancy tech stuff. I still use an old flip phone." "Nothing wrong with retro sometimes," I said as I looked around Jeb's kitchen and saw a couple of guns sitting next to his back door, a rifle and a shotgun. Sometimes I'd forget where I moved, and this was totally normal. "So, it's just you in the house?" Jeb turned with a jar full of sugar in his hand and nodded. "Yep, the kids are all grown up now and the wife ran off a few years back." "Oh, I'm sorry to hear." "Don't be, I'm better off without her nagging my ear off." "Women, you know," Jeb chuckled again. "You live by yourself, right?" "Yeah," I said, slightly caught off guard by his assumption as he handed me the cup of sugar. It was more than a cup. "Thanks, Jeb." "No problem, that's what good neighbors do." The only sound was the clicking of my keyboard when I heard a faint knock at the front door. I continued typing, hoping to get the last email sent off, but the knocking grew louder, more insistent, and finally aggressive. "1 second, I'm coming," I shouted, hitting enter to send the email. It must have been the 30th time I'd hit send. But the knocking stopped before I reached the door. As I opened it, I saw Jeb marching angrily over to an ATV and retrieving a shotgun. He pointed it in the air, pulled the trigger, and a boom erupted across the air. "What the hell?" I screamed, startled. Jeb, who had noticed me at the door, grinned widely. He placed the gun on the ATV and shuffled over to me. "That's called a holler doorbell," he explained. "Okay, I've never heard of that," I replied. "But I would appreciate it if you didn't do that." His grin vanished, replaced by a blank expression. "How was I supposed to get your attention then?" he asked bluntly. "The knock got my attention," I said. "I was on my way to the door. I was just in my office." "I saw your car, figured you were home," he stated, standing inches from me, peering into my doorway. "Sorry, I know you're new around here. I didn't think it through." "It's okay, I guess," I said. "So what's up, Jeb?" "I was just wondering, if you have a stick of butter," he asked, his gleeful grin returning. My nerves, however, were still a little rattled. "Mind if I borrow some?" "Are you going to bring a stick and quarter next time?" I awkwardly tried to joke. He looked at me in silence for almost 10 seconds, but then his head tilted back and he laughed loudly, even harder than the time he used the same joke. "Good one, sir." "All right, let's get you a stick of butter," I replied, starting to feel a little more at ease as I walked inside. Jeb followed, his eyes darting back and forth as if he was soaking in my house. "Really gave this place a facelift, didn't you?" Yay, I've owned it for a couple months before I moved in, I answered as we walked through the house towards the kitchen. It just needed a little modernizing, you know. By golly, it almost feels like I walked into the future, Jeb chortled, as the two of us stepped into my kitchen. As I opened the refrigerator and pulled out a stick of butter, handing it over to him. Nothing too fancy, I assure you, I said while handing him the stick of butter. He continued to scan everything around him silently as held on to the butter. So, got any plans for the weekend? Just gonna be watching college games. Ah, are your kids coming over? He sneered and said, They don't come around, Jake. Oh, sorry, I just thought. Why would you bring that up? He asked coldly, his face blank. Do I ask you about your dumb family? Excuse me. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that, he replied, his grin returning, though it felt unnerving. All right, well, I am sorry if it feels like I am rushing you out the door, I replied. But I have to get back to work. I get it. You got to get back to that fancy moon man job, Jeb said with a hearty laugh. Thanks for the butter, neighbor. It's no problem, I said, as we walked to the front door. He patted me on the back a couple of times, but something about his eyes when he did it was off, as if he was wishing he was slapping me. All right, I will see you around sometime. Yay, see you around, I said nervously, as I watched him walk down to his ATV. He turned around one last time, giving a big wave with an even bigger smile before mounting his vehicle and revving the engine loudly. I wasn't sleeping well. The sound of ATV engines and wheels kept creeping into my dreams, waking me up. My phone displayed 3:45 a.m. I got out of bed, turning on the light before heading downstairs for a glass of water. I hoped hydrating would allow me to fall back asleep. As I returned to my bedroom, I debated for a moment whether to go back to sleep or simply start my day early. As I walked over to my window, I gazed out at the scenery. It was an adjustment from city life, but I was slowly starting to appreciate the quiet. However, that appreciation was brief as I scanned the field and saw something in the distance. There, standing in the pasture, sitting on an ATV and looking directly at my window, was Jeb. What? I quickly turned off my light to feign sleep, but I could hear it. Maybe it wasn't a dream. Could Jeb have been circling my property with his ATV all night? No, that's crazy. But so is sitting in a field at 3:45 a.m. It was a faint, but slow rumble in the distance as I stood frozen in the dark bedroom. It inched closer, each second sending a thudding tremor through my chest. Before I knew it, I heard a knock at the door. A few seconds later, another knock, this time heavier and more aggressive. Maybe he'll think I'm asleep. No, I'm an idiot for even thinking that. He's clearly unhinged. I needed to call the cops, but I didn't want him to see me move, so I did the only thing that came to mind. I crawled, the knocking growing angrier and louder, slowly inching on my knees towards my nightstand to reach my phone. Then came the loud bang. I was stiffly on my hands and knees as glass rained down on me. I looked up to see my bedroom window shattered from the shotgun blast. Oh, looks like my late-night doorbell might have been a little off-center, Jeb yelled with his hearty laugh. You blew out my window, I yelled back. So you are awake. Anyone would be awake with an ATV drive-by. Suppose you're right about that, Jeb responded. You think I can grab a beer? No, it's almost 4 a.m. Well, I was going to do some smockin' takes about 12 hours. I don't care, I screamed. You shot my window out and I am calling the cops. It was silent for a moment, giving me the slight bit of hope that my threat to call the police would make him go away. But after another one of his laughs, Jeb said, That's not very neighborly of you to call the cops. You shot my window out, I yelled, crawling over to where my phone lay and beginning to dial 911. Seriously, Jeb, go home and wait for the cops there. You know how far out we are? Jeb responded with a cold tone. We are about 45 minutes away from town. And if you're lucky, just maybe they have a trooper station down at the exit. But around this time, he's usually at the Buck E's watching YouTube videos and eating jerky. Jeb, I am calling them now, I yelled one more time, but was greeted not by a response, but another shotgun blast that shattered the remaining window frame. I just need a beer, Jake, Jeb screamed. Hell, I'll even bring you a platter of what I'm smoking. I don't have any beer. What kind of man lives in the country and doesn't have beer? Me, this guy, the one who had his window shot out and is about to call the cops. I don't believe you, he shouted. No, I am actually calling the cops, I shouted back. Not about that, Jeb hurled back. About the beer, I know you got one in the fridge. What? I want to see for myself, Jeb screamed. I want to know if you are just lying and not being a good neighbor. I am not letting you in, I countered loudly. Fear gripped me as I heard an ATV engine roar to life. Peeking out the window, I braced myself for the worst. Jeb was revving his engine. He launched himself towards my house, and a tremendous thud shook the front door. I knew I had to get out, and quickly. I ran downstairs and dialed 911. 911, what is your emergency? The operator's voice crackled. My neighbor. He's trying to break into my house with his ATV. He's been shooting at me, I screamed, the sound of the engine deafening as Jeb rammed the front door. The wood splintered, and the frame groaned under the pressure from the ATV. Sir, are you somewhere safe? The operator asked. No, he's trying to break in. Sir, try to find a safe place. I am dispatching someone now, the operator replied. I fled towards the kitchen, past the refrigerator, and towards the back door, desperate to escape my own home from Jeb. It was frigid outside, but I heard the front door finally succumb to the constant assault as I scrambled further into the biting cold. I had to escape. I started running towards the edge of my property, but then I heard Jeb shout, "You were right, you didn't have any beer." I turned to see him standing at my back door, but all I could do was run. My ribs ached with every pounding step, but the sickening roar of the ATV grew louder. Horror gripped me as I saw Jeb approaching, his face a mask of grim determination. "I'm gonna get ya," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the pastures and woods. I called the cops, I shouted back, but my words seemed to only fuel his pursuit. He slowed momentarily, as if toying with me, before unleashing the ATV again. I could hear his manic laughter in the distance. All right, this time I'm really gonna get ya. The engine roared, propelling him forward with renewed speed. I pushed myself harder, my eyes fixed on the creek embankment, my last hope of escape. "You think you can get away?" Jeb shouted, his face inches from mine as we raced side by side. "Don't you know what it's like to be a good neighbor?" He stared at me, then swerved his head, realizing we were both heading towards the creek bed. Panic flared in his eyes. He slammed on the brakes, attempting a sharp turn, but the ATV flipped, throwing Jeb off as it barrel rolled several times into the field. I stopped running, my sides burning. An eerie silence descended, broken only by the distant wail of approaching sirens. A loud moan pierced the air. I approached Jeb, who laid on the ground, his head bleeding profusely, his legs twisted in unnatural ways. A chilling grin spread across his face. "Be a good neighbor now," he groaned, "and call an ambulance." When I first laid eyes on the house, I felt a magnetic pull that I couldn't explain. It was nestled on a sprawling lot at the edge of a sleepy New England town, surrounded by towering pines that whispered in the breeze. The house itself was a sprawling Victorian, its weathered facade framed by climbing ivy and ornate gables. It was the kind of place you read about in old novels, charming, mysterious, and just a little foreboding. "This house has good bones," the real estate agent chirped, her manicured nails tapping on the doorframe as we stepped inside. The interior was as grand as I'd hoped. Vaulted ceilings, intricate crown molding, and stained glass windows that cast fragmented rainbows on the wooden floors. But it wasn't perfect. A faint scent of mildew lingered in the air, and the walls bore the faint scars of a hurried renovation. "This was the Stafford family home," the agent explained, her voice dropping as if we were sharing a secret. They were a prominent family in the area for decades. Wealthy, well-connected. Tragedy struck about 10 years ago, and the house has been on and off the market ever since. "What kind of tragedy?" I asked, my voice echoing slightly in the cavernous entryway. The agent waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, you know how small towns are. Gossip. Rumors. But it's a great investment, Emily. It's priced to sell." I bought it. Maybe it was impulsive, but I needed a fresh start. My life in the city had been suffocating. A high-stakes job in corporate marketing, a failed engagement, and a deep, gnawing loneliness I couldn't shake. This house, with its peeling wallpaper and dusty chandeliers, felt like a chance to rebuild something, myself included. A week later, I stood on the front porch with 2 suitcases and a growing sense of excitement. The movers wouldn't arrive until morning, but I didn't mind spending the first night alone. The quiet of the countryside was a welcome change from the constant hum of traffic and voices I'd grown accustomed to. As I unlocked the front door, I noticed a figure standing in the garden. It was a woman dressed in a modest gray dress and a white apron, her silver hair neatly pinned back. She had a stern but not unfriendly face, her sharp eyes scanning me as if taking stock. "Miss Clark?" she asked, her voice clipped but polite. "Yes," I said, a little startled. "I'm Mrs. Wentworth." "The housekeeper," she said, stepping forward and extending a gloved hand. "The agency informed me you'd be arriving today. I've been with the Stafford family for over 30 years, and I'm here to ensure the house remains in order during your stay." "Stay?" I blinked, confused. "I bought the house. I'm planning to live here." Her lips tightened, but she recovered quickly. "Of course. My apologies. Old habits. I hope you'll find my services useful. I've taken the liberty of preparing the kitchen and airing out the bedrooms." I thanked her, though something about her presence unsettled me. She moved through the house like she owned it, straightening a vase here, dusting a shelf there. I tried to remind myself that she was probably just trying to be helpful, but as the evening wore on, her constant hovering began to grate on me. By the time I went to bed, she'd retreated to her quarters in the servants' wing, leaving me alone in the cavernous silence of the house. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and listening to the faint creaks and groans of the old wood settling. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I awoke to the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment, I thought I was back in my apartment in the city, but the unfamiliar sounds of chirping birds and distant rustling reminded me where I was. I pulled on a sweater and descended the creaking staircase, my steps echoing in the vastness of the empty house. Mrs. Wentworth was already in the kitchen. She was a picture of precision, her movements deliberate as she set a steaming cup of coffee on the table. "Good morning, Miss Clark," she said without looking up. "Good morning," I replied, slightly unnerved by how seamlessly she had integrated herself into my routine. "You didn't have to do that." "It's my duty," she said, her tone flat but resolute. "This house requires care, and so do its occupants. Breakfast will be ready shortly." I thanked her and sat at the table, sipping my coffee. The kitchen was brighter than I remembered, sunlight streaming through the lace curtains and glinting off the antique copper pots hanging from the walls. For a moment, it felt almost cozy, until I noticed Mrs. Wentworth watching me out of the corner of her eye. "Do you live nearby?" I asked, trying to break the silence. "I have a small cottage on the edge of the property," she replied. "The Staffords built it for me when I first began my service here. It's close enough to tend to the house, but far enough to provide privacy." Her words were polite, but something about the way she said service sent a chill up my spine. I quickly changed the subject. "So, you've been with this house a long time. You must have seen a lot." Her expression hardened slightly, but she kept her voice steady. "The Staffords were good people. This house was their pride and joy. It's a shame what happened." "What did happen?" I pressed, curious despite myself. She hesitated, her hands pausing mid-wipe over the counter. "An accident," she said finally. "Their eldest son drowned in the lake out back. A tragedy for the family." I frowned. The agent hadn't mentioned a lake. I didn't realize there was a lake here. "It's hidden by the woods," she said. "Not many people know about it. Dangerous waters. Best to stay away." The way she said it felt like a warning, and I couldn't help but feel a prickle of unease. Later that day, I explored the property. The house seemed even larger now that I was trying to fill it, its empty rooms echoing with my footsteps. I found old photographs tucked away in drawers, yellowed papers in the attic, and an ornate key that didn't seem to fit any of the locks. The woods behind the house were dense and overgrown, but I was determined to find the lake. The further I walked, the quieter it became, the only sounds the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional bird call. Finally, I came to a small clearing where the ground sloped down to a stagnant pool of water. It wasn't a lake so much as a large pond, its surface coated with algae and debris. I stood there for a moment, staring at the water. It was oddly still, almost unnatural. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something shiny on the ground. A locket, half buried in the mud. I picked it up and wiped it clean, revealing an intricate design of roses etched into the silver. When I opened it, I found a photograph inside. A family portrait, faded but unmistakable. The Staffords. A twig snapped behind me, and I spun around, heart pounding. Mrs. Wentworth was standing at the edge of the clearing, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. I was just. "It's not safe," she interrupted, stepping closer. "This place has a way of holding on to things that don't belong. Come back to the house." I followed her without protest, clutching the locket in my hand. Back at the house, she seemed to regain her composure, offering to make tea as if nothing had happened. But her warning echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't telling me everything. That night, I locked my bedroom door. The days that followed were an exercise in quiet unease. Mrs. Wentworth was ever present, always just a room away, polishing silver, sweeping the halls, or tidying up spaces I hadn't even touched. It was as if the house itself demanded constant attention, though I couldn't see why. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional creak of floorboards or the whisper of wind through the trees. One morning, I decided I needed some space. "Mrs. Wentworth," I said, setting my coffee cup down with a firmness I hoped came across as polite but resolute. "You've been so helpful, but I think I'd like to spend today exploring on my own. Please take the day off." Her eyes flicked to mine, her smile thin and unconvincing. "This house requires vigilance, Miss Clark. There are things you might overlook." "I'll manage," I insisted. For a moment, I thought she might argue, but she simply nodded. "Very well, I'll tend to my cottage, but if you need anything at all, you know where to find me." The moment she left, the house seemed to exhale. I wandered through the rooms without her shadow trailing behind me, taking my time to absorb the details I'd missed before. In the study, I found old ledgers and handwritten letters tucked into a roll-top desk, their ink faded but still legible. Most were mundane, lists of expenses, notes about household repairs. But one letter caught my attention. It was addressed to Mr. Stafford and written in a trembling hand. The writer spoke of strange occurrences, items moving on their own, doors that wouldn't stay locked, and the sensation of being watched. The final line sent a shiver down my spine. "I fear the house is remembering too much." The words lingered with me as I ventured outside. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house, with all its creaks and whispers, did indeed have a memory. Perhaps that's why it had drawn me here. I found myself walking toward the woods again, drawn to the clearing where I'd discovered the locket. The pond was as still and murky as before, but now I noticed something else. A faint shimmer beneath the surface. I knelt at the edge, trying to see what it was. The water was too dark, but I was certain something was down there. "Miss Clark." Mrs. Wentworth's voice made me jump. I turned to see her standing at the edge of the clearing, her face pale and tight with tension. "I told you this place wasn't safe," she said, stepping closer. Her eyes darted to the pond and back to me. "You mustn't linger here." "I found a locket," I said, holding it out as if to explain my presence. Her expression froze, and for a moment, I thought I saw fear flicker in her eyes. "That belonged to Elena Stafford," she said quietly. "She was wearing it the day her brother drowned." I blinked, taken aback. "You didn't mention a sister." "She left shortly after the tragedy," Mrs. Wentworth said, her voice clipped. "The family fell apart after that. It's all in the past." But her tone suggested otherwise. I tucked the locket into my pocket, unsure what else to say. As we walked back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. That night, I stayed up late, poring over the letters and photographs I'd found. I was determined to piece together the history of this house, even if Mrs. Wentworth wouldn't tell me the whole story. Around midnight, I heard a noise. A faint rustling, like someone moving just outside my door. I froze, listening intently. The sound came again, followed by a soft creak. My heart pounded as I crept toward the door and peered through the keyhole. Nothing. But when I opened the door, I found something lying on the floor. A single rose petal, fresh and crimson. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I woke to the sound of humming. It was faint at first, a lilting tune that seemed to weave through the cracks in the old house. I sat up, disoriented, and glanced at the clock. It was barely dawn, and the light filtering through the curtains was pale and gray. The humming grew louder. It was coming from downstairs. Against my better judgment, I wrapped a blanket around myself and ventured out of the room, my bare feet whispering against the cool wooden floor. As I descended the staircase, the tune became clearer. An old lullaby, haunting and melodic. Mrs. Wentworth was in the parlor, dusting the mantel. She didn't seem to notice me at first, her movements almost mechanical as she worked. "Mrs. Wentworth," I called softly. She froze mid-motion, her head snapping toward me. For a moment, her face was unreadable, the shadows from the morning light deepening the lines around her mouth and eyes. Then she smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning, Miss Clark," she said, her voice smooth and even. "Were you humming just now?" She tilted her head slightly, as if considering her answer. "It's a habit, I suppose. I often hum while I work. Did it disturb you?" "No," I said quickly. "It's just, I don't think I've ever heard that song before." "It's an old tune," she replied, turning back to her work. "The Staffords were fond of it. Mrs. Stafford used to sing it to her children." Something about the way she said it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I decided to change the subject. "Do you know anything about this?" I asked, pulling the locket from my pocket and holding it out to her. Her eyes darkened as they fell on the locket. "I told you before, it belonged to Eleanor Stafford. Where did you find it?" "By the pond," I said, watching her reaction closely. She stiffened, her hands gripping the edge of the mantel. "You should return it to where you found it. Some things are better left undisturbed." "Why?" I pressed, stepping closer. "What aren't you telling me?" She turned to face me fully, her expression hard. "This house has a history, Miss Clark. A history that is better left buried. You would do well to respect that." Before I could respond, she swept past me and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me alone with my questions. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I couldn't focus on anything, my mind circling back to the locket, the pond, and Mrs. Wentworth's cryptic warning. By the time night fell, I was more determined than ever to uncover the truth. I waited until the house was silent before slipping out of my room. The moonlight streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the walls as I made my way to the study. I had a feeling that whatever secrets this house held, they would be hidden there. The roll-top desk seemed to beckon me, its drawers and compartments a treasure trove of forgotten memories. I sifted through the letters and papers, my fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. Pulling it out, I found a small, tarnished key. My pulse quickened. The ornate key I'd found earlier. It matched this one. I held them side by side, marveling at their craftsmanship. They had to open something important. A sudden noise made me jump. A soft creak like a floorboard settling. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I turned toward the doorway. There was nothing there. But as I stood in the eerie silence, I felt it again. That sense of being watched. Clutching the keys tightly, I made my way back to my room, locking the door behind me. Whatever this house was hiding, I was certain of one thing. Mrs. Wentworth wasn't the only one keeping secrets. I spent the next day in a state of restless anticipation. The keys I had found seemed to pulse with significance, as though they held the answers to all the questions that had been building since I arrived. Mrs. Wentworth was uncharacteristically absent, and I took the opportunity to search the house further. The attic was my destination this time. The narrow staircase groaned under my weight as I ascended, the air growing cooler with each step. Dust motes danced in the thin rays of light filtering through the single grimy window at the far end of the space. The attic was a graveyard of forgotten possessions. Old trunks, faded furniture, and boxes labeled in cursive that had long since faded to illegibility. I began opening the trunks one by one. The first held moth-eaten clothing that smelled faintly of lavender and mildew. The second contained books, their spines cracked and their pages yellowed with age. But it was the third trunk that caught my breath. Inside were photographs, journals, and what appeared to be a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon. I picked up a photograph, its edges curling and brittle. It was of a young woman with dark hair and striking eyes. She stood by the pond, the same pond where I'd found the locket, her hand resting on the shoulder of a young boy. The back of the photo was labeled, Eleanor and Charles, Summer 1934. The letters told a story. They were written by Eleanor to her brother, Charles, during a time when she had been away from the house. They spoke of her longing to return, of her distrust for someone referred to only as the caretaker. As I read, the pieces began to fall into place. The caretaker, Mrs. Wentworth, or perhaps someone who had held the role before her, had been a presence in the family's life for generations. But Eleanor's letters hinted at something darker. She knows too much, Charles. The way she watches us, the way she speaks of the house as though it belongs to her. I fear she's hiding something, and I worry for you most of all. My hands trembled as I folded the letter and returned it to the trunk. What had Mrs. Wentworth been hiding all these years? And why was she still here, watching over this house with such intensity? I left the attic with more questions than answers and made my way to the basement, clutching the keys tightly in my hand. If there was any place in this house that held secrets, it was there. The air grew colder as I descended the stairs, and the smell of damp earth filled my nostrils. At the far end of the basement was an old, iron-bound chest. My heart raced as I inserted one of the keys into the lock. It fit perfectly, and with a soft click, the chest creaked open. Inside were items that made my stomach churn. Jewelry, watches, and other trinkets that I recognized from the photographs I had found. These were the Staffords' belongings, things that should have been passed down through generations. And beneath them, something more sinister, a collection of photographs and newspaper clippings. The photos showed different families, all standing in front of the house. The clippings detailed accidents, disappearances, and tragedies that had befallen each family. She takes what she wants and discards the rest. The voice made me whirl around, the blood draining from my face. Mrs. Wentworth stood at the bottom of the stairs, her expression colder than I had ever seen. "You shouldn't have come down here, Miss Clark," she said, her voice steady but tinged with something dark and menacing. "What is all this?" I demanded, gesturing to the chest. "You've been stealing from these families, haven't you? And those accidents, they weren't accidents, were they?" Her lips curved into a chilling smile. "You've been digging too deep, my dear. Some histories are better left buried." I backed away, clutching the keys like a lifeline. "You've been manipulating people, scaring them into leaving so you could take what you wanted. Why?" "Because this house belongs to me," she said simply. "The Staffords were merely tenants, just as you are now. I've been the keeper of this place for decades, ensuring it remains as it should be." I shook my head, disbelief and anger warring within me. "The authorities will know about this." Her smile faltered, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes that looked like fear. "You won't make it that far." Before I could react, she lunged for me, her hands reaching for the keys. I dodged her, scrambling toward the stairs, my heart pounding as I fled. I slammed the basement door behind me, turning the lock with trembling hands. My heart raced as I pressed my ear to the wood, listening for any sound of pursuit. The silence was deafening, but I knew Mrs. Wentworth wouldn't give up that easily. Clutching the keys, I bolted for the study. If I could call the authorities, I might have a chance. But the moment I entered, the sound of the rotary phone being ripped from the wall made me freeze. Mrs. Wentworth stood by the desk, the phone cord dangling in her hand. "You think you can ruin everything I've built?" she hissed, her calm demeanor shattered. Her gray eyes burned with a fury I hadn't thought possible. "This isn't your house, Mrs. Wentworth," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "And those aren't your things. You've been stealing, lying, and hurting people for decades." "They didn't deserve it," she snapped, throwing the phone aside. "The Staffords, the families before them, they didn't understand this house like I do. They saw it as a status symbol, a stepping stone. But I've kept it alive. I've preserved its history." "By destroying lives," I demanded, my voice rising. by driving people out and stealing from them. This is madness." Her lips twisted into a cruel smile. "You're just like the rest of them. Naive, ungrateful. But you're not leaving, Miss Clark. Not with those keys." She lunged at me again, and I barely dodged her, stumbling backward into a bookshelf. Books tumbled to the floor as I scrambled to regain my footing. She was faster than I expected, her movements unnervingly quick for someone her age. I grabbed a heavy candlestick from the desk and swung it wildly. She ducked, but the motion gave me enough time to dart out of the study and toward the front door. I fumbled with the locks, my hands slick with sweat, but before I could turn the knob, she was there, dragging me backward with surprising strength. "You don't understand what this house needs," she growled, her grip like iron. I twisted free and bolted up the staircase, taking 2 steps at a time. My room was my only refuge. If I could lock the door and barricade myself inside, I might have a chance to think. I slammed the door shut and locked it, shoving the dresser against it for good measure. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my mind racing. The stolen items in the basement were proof of her crimes, but I needed more. I needed her to admit it. "Emily," her voice carried through the house, eerily calm now. "You can't stay in there forever. This is my house, and you're trespassing. Just give me the keys, and we can put all this behind us." I looked around the room, my gaze falling on my phone. My hands shook as I dialed 911, praying the call would go through. To my relief, a dispatcher answered. "There's someone in my house," I whispered, my voice trembling. "She's dangerous. Please, send someone quickly." The dispatcher asked for my address, and I gave it, my heart pounding as Mrs. Wentworth's footsteps creaked up the stairs. "Emily," she called again, her voice closer now. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The doorknob rattled, and then came the sound of her trying to force the door open. "This is your last chance," she warned, her voice low and menacing. "I've already called the police," I shouted, hoping to buy myself time. There was a pause, and then she laughed. A cold, hollow sound that sent chills down my spine. "Do you think that will stop me?" Suddenly, the sound of sirens pierced the night, growing louder as they approached. Mrs. Wentworth's laughter stopped abruptly. I heard her retreating down the stairs, her footsteps hurried and frantic. Moments later, I heard the front door burst open and voices shouting commands. I cautiously moved the dresser and opened the door, peering out to see 2 officers standing at the bottom of the stairs. "She's in the basement," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The officers moved quickly, and within minutes, they emerged with Mrs. Wentworth in handcuffs. Her face was pale, her eyes wild. As they led her past me, she hissed, "You've ruined everything. You don't understand what you've done." I watched as they took her away, the weight of the past few days crashing down on me. In the days that followed, the stolen items were cataloged and returned to the rightful owners. The authorities uncovered evidence of Mrs. Wentworth's scheme to scare off families and sell the house to buyers involved in illegal dealings. As for me, I decided to leave the house behind. It was no longer a place of charm and promise. It was a place of darkness, of secrets better left buried. Our neighbors wear our clothes. So, I've been a horror fan since I can remember. My brother and I used to binge watch 90s and 2000s horrors and slashers film every night. But this didn't prepare me from the shit that's been happening lately. This first started when we moved here 2 weeks ago, in a secluded town near the Appalachian, far north than I can remember. My father got promoted to supervise a nearby mine, so we had no choice but to relocate to this town. At first it was okay, the locals are not that far from your average citizen. They were quite friendly, almost too friendly to my brother's liking, who's usually judged and criticized for his choice of dark clothings. So when his clothes started going missing from the clothing rack in our backyard, we initially thought it was the wind, until we saw his black Metallica printed socks being worn by our classmate who's also living next to us. Being the confrontational twin, my brother demanded that he give it back. Fortunately, the two didn't break into a fight, and the other just gave his socks willingly. I thought that was the end of it. until last week, my mother's blazer went missing. I'm not usually quick to assume things, but from the fiasco that happened last week, I know that I have to tell her what happened. But she disregarded, telling me that she might have misplaced it like she usually did to some of her belongings. My brother and I stopped pushing her to it. She always wanted to make a good impression to the people around her, and the last thing she wanted is to point a finger to someone she barely know. So we let it happen. The next thing we knew, her dress was gone, her jacket missing, and even her shoes that she safely tucked in our shoe cabinet inside our house was gone missing as well. My mother's concern finally went to our father, and we reported to the police the next day. They made a search to their house and didn't find anything. My brother and I were grounded after that, especially my twin, who was adamant to help with the search. Now that our neighbors knew what happened, we kept a low profile for a while, disregarding the stares we've been getting since that day. It's just so weird that we are being scrutinized when we were the ones with the stolen items. And just 3 days ago, when our parents went out and my brother went somewhere with his friends, I was left alone to guard whatever we have in the house. And I made sure that our clothes, shoes, anything that can be stolen is kept safe inside. I dead-bolted all the doors and locked the windows to make sure that no one gets in. And as the day slowly goes dark, the eerie feeling of being watched keeps getting stronger. I was restless. The TV that has been my only company the whole night was drowned out by my thoughts, and I felt completely alone, yet can't shake off the feeling that I wasn't. That there's someone with me at the moment. My anxiety led me to call my brother, but his phone was out of reach. My parents took the call but disregarded whatever I told them. By the time I ended the call, I was already in my room, locked from the eerie quiet of what's outside. LT didn't take long when I heard something. Like someone was walking with their tippy toe. The soft creak of our wooden floors gave it away, but the sound of my heart beating on my chest almost made me miss it. This confirms my suspicion. I peeped through the gap between the floor and my bedroom's door. The light outside the living room remained on, and I can see the vacant room clearly. It remained quiet like there's no one outside, but the minty smell coming from somewhere gave it out. I know there's someone out there, like someone is purposely trying to scare me. Whatever this is, this didn't look like a typical break-in. They wouldn't have left a trace nor a smell, but the strong coolness of mint left my brain foggy. I stood up to barricade the door with a chair when suddenly a voice came out from the other side. It sounds like my mother. She was asking me to come out, like she knew that I'm in my room the whole time. I didn't respond. I'm already scared shitless to utter a word. But for some reason I crouched back to see what's outside. And I shouldn't have done it. Because from out of the normal, the sofas, the turned-off TV, and the lamp table besides the television, the only thing that stands out like sore thumb is a foot standing irregularly stiff, a few feet from my door. Wearing the same shoe. My mother was convinced she misplaced. She didn't knock nor tried to break in. She just stand there waiting for me to say anything or do anything. And when it already feels like an hour, she took a step forward, but with the tip of her sandals, her heels up. Walking on tippy toes towards my room, she called again. Her voice was soft and not threatening. This time I used my body along with the chair to barricade what's out there. She keeps calling my name as if she knows me. Using the voice, I thought it was my mother, but hers was a bit deeper, almost an imitation. She didn't bang the door nor force herself in. She just stands there, waiting for me to do something. I remember how sweaty I was despite the cold, and I almost forgot how that night ended. All I knew is my brother found me sleeping next to the chair I used to barricade with. He said my room was open before he got back, and I was lying limp with my head on the chair, sleeping soundly. If that was a dream. That was the most messed up shit I've ever experienced, and I won't take it any other than that. Still, I can't help but ask myself, who opened the door before my brother, or even let himself in? I think my neighbors were kidnapped and replaced with clones. Lately, my neighbors haven't been the same. They used to smile, laugh, and be a generally normal couple. Now, they do neither. Just to add some backstory, Sean and Ellie Carpenter moved into the neighborhood on July 14th, 2014. Me and my wife, Elizabeth, had been one of the first people to meet them. They were very nice. 2 days after they moved in, we was invited to their house for tea. We accepted the invite. Ellie made tea for the three of us plus herself. Once it was done, she and Elizabeth went into the living room, while myself and Sean sat in the kitchen and talked. I learned that me and Sean liked a lot of the same things: football, Breaking Bad, rock music, and video games, just to name a few. An hour into our conversation, Elizabeth tells me we have to go to Tesco, the UK version of Walmart, for those of you who don't know, and that I had to go with her. I asked if I could stay and continue my conversation with Sean, since she had flat out interrupted me in the middle of talking. But she said I needed to come with her for some bad reason that I can't remember, believe me. I love my wife dearly, but I swear some of the shit she does is questionable. So I had to leave. I said bye to Sean, thanked Ellie for the nice tea, and then we left. For the next 3 years, we continued our friendship with the Carpenters. Me and Sean went to football games together, played Halo on the Xbox, and listened to music together, all whilst Ellie and Elizabeth talked about gossip or some shit in the living room. I'd like to say that we continued our friendship into our elderly years, and then we died and were buried next to each other, and then we lived happily ever after in the afterlife. But that wasn't the case, unfortunately, because something unusual happened. It was 3rd of March 2017. Me and Elizabeth were heading over to the Carpenters because they had invited us the day previous, but we declined due to personal reasons, so we were making it up to them. We knocked on the door and they opened it. The first sign that something was wrong was when Sean didn't say his usual, "How are you guys doing this fine evening?" No, he said, "Welcome," before he and Ellie beckoned us into the house. Me and Sean headed to the kitchen, while Elizabeth and Ellie went into the living room. I tried to make conversation with Sean, but he remained silent. However, he did do some strange things like licking my face, poking my cheeks, and most unsettling of all, he stared at me the way people would stare at a ghost if they encountered one for the first time. His eyes were opened wider than I had ever seen them. I cannot tell you how hard it was to avoid looking at that eerie gaze for half an hour. At certain times when giving in and looking, I could almost see a grin on his face. 30 minutes after arriving, my wife said we had to go to Tesco, but this time I didn't argue. We said goodbye to them, but they didn't say anything. They just kept staring at us until we left. Even though my wife said we were going to Tesco, we were in fact going home. Apparently Ellie had been creeping my wife out, so after putting up with her for 30 minutes, she decided to leave. Now I wish that was the end of it, but it sadly wasn't. That night, Elizabeth was upstairs taking her makeup off, and I was downstairs listening to some scary true stories in the kitchen, while washing dishes and cleaning the floor. At one point, I decided to look out the window, and I saw something that, to this day, I can't get out of my head. It was Ellie and Sean. They were sitting at their kitchen table just staring at me, their eyes showing little to no emotion. I was severely creeped out, but I didn't mention it to my wife because I didn't want to scare her. So we got into bed and talked for a bit before we went to sleep. I awoke at 4 a.m. to the sound of Elizabeth's horrific screams from downstairs. I got my baseball bat and ran as fast as I would if there was a rocket up my ass. I found Elizabeth on the floor crying. When I asked her what was wrong, she simply said, "Window." I looked out the window and saw Ellie and Sean still staring, but this time they were smiling the most unsettling smile I've ever seen. I decided sometime the next day I'd go to Sean's house to question him about all the bizarre shit he's doing lately. The next day, after lunch, I went over to Sean and Ellie's house. I just wanted an explanation for what's been happening, but I didn't get one. I walked to the front door and knocked, but they didn't answer. After waiting on the stoop for 10 minutes, I decided to let myself in. The door was unlocked. So I went in and found something unexplainable. Everything in the house was gone. The tables, the portraits, the chairs, the TV, even the wallpaper was gone. Everything was gone upstairs as well. Their beds had vanished. The toilet has disappeared. Everything else was gone. I decided not to tell my wife when I got home. Anyway, the next morning, after breakfast, I looked out the kitchen window, where I had a clear view of the Carpenter's kitchen, and I felt physically ill. The kitchen was the same as it usually was. Nothing was out of place. I told my wife I forgot something at their house and I wanted to retrieve it. I then left to go to the carpenter's residence. I knocked on the door and Ellie answered. I told her I had left a video game in their house and I wanted it back. She nodded her head and let me in the house. I didn't forget anything. I just wanted to see if everything returned, and sure enough, it had returned. The portraits were back, the TV had returned, everything was normal. Not a single thing was out of place. I told Ellie I couldn't find what I was looking for. Then I left. Now here's my theory on what happened. Sean and Ellie were kidnapped and replaced with clones. Now I know that seems a bit far-fetched, but this is the only explainable theory I can come up with. The change of their personality was very sudden, and if my theory is correct, who kidnapped them? The only thing I can't explain is their house being empty that one day I go to their house, and then it being back to normal the next day. If any of you reading have your own theories on what happened, feel free to let me know. All I know is, my neighbors are acting really strange lately, and I honestly don't want to be friends with them if they keep acting like this. We may even move house soon, who knows. But for now, I don't want anything to do with Sean and Ellie Carpenter. I think that might be for the best, though. I never expected to feel so out of place in a quiet suburban neighborhood. But here I am, tucked away in a small town that seemed so perfect when I first looked at it. A peaceful retreat from the chaos of city life. My name is Mark, and I'm a writer, an introvert by nature, and my work had started to feel like a cage in the city. The constant noise, the pressure, the distractions, they all bled into my thoughts, suffocating the creativity I once found so easy. Moving here was supposed to be the answer, a place to breathe, to think, and, hopefully, to write. The house I had chosen was a charming two-story cottage, nestled between two others, each with their own patch of neatly trimmed lawn and picket fences. There was a certain serenity to it, like the town had been frozen in time, unaware of the noise and distractions that defined the world outside. The kind of place where neighbors waved at each other as they passed, where the air felt cleaner, less polluted by the constant rush of life. I spent the first few days unpacking and settling in, exploring the local surroundings. A small creek ran behind the house, and there was a forested trail that led to a park with benches by the water. I imagined myself walking there every morning, trying to find inspiration as I looked out over the placid stream. I could already see the setting of my next novel taking shape in the quiet, but I had yet to meet my most peculiar neighbor, Mr. Klein. It was only on the fourth day that I first noticed him. His house was the one next door, slightly larger than mine, with a weathered red door that looked like it hadn't been painted in years. Mr. Klein was an older man, somewhere in his 60s. With a wiry frame and a collection of eccentric habits. He had this unsettling way of peering out his window at me, watching as I moved about in my yard, or as I sat on my porch, typing away at my laptop. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, he was just a curious neighbor, right? But it was the way he spoke to me when we finally exchanged pleasantries that set something off. His voice was quiet, almost too soft, as if he was carefully considering every word before he spoke. "I see you're working hard on something," he said one afternoon when I was sitting outside, the sun setting low behind the house. "Your characters, they really have a way of getting under your skin, don't they?" I blinked, unsure of what to make of the comment. Yeah, I guess so." I smiled, feeling slightly awkward. "Such depth," he continued, leaning against the side of his house. "Especially the ones who don't fit in, the ones who are misunderstood. They really make you think, don't they?" His eyes gleamed, not in admiration, but something darker. Something I couldn't place. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I brushed it off. I was probably just being paranoid. Writers tend to be sensitive to everything, and I'd heard stories of eccentric fans or overly inquisitive neighbors before. He was just interested. But as the days went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Klein was more than just a harmless neighbor. It felt like he was watching me, really watching me, in a way that was beginning to unsettle me. The strange comments continued, always in passing, always when I was working. Sometimes he'd ask about a character's backstory or their motivations, and other times he would comment on the plot, as if he'd read my work, without me ever having shown him a word. I found myself becoming increasingly wary, though I tried to dismiss the idea that there was anything sinister at play. Writers are paranoid by nature, aren't they? It was probably just my imagination. But then, things started to disappear. The first thing I noticed missing was a notebook. It was a small, leather-bound journal where I jotted down ideas, fragments of dialogue, and concepts that hadn't yet found a place in my work. I had left it on the desk in my study the night before, but when I sat down to write the next morning, it was gone. At first, I thought maybe I'd misplaced it. Writers are forgetful, right? But then I started to notice other things. Smaller items, things that I hadn't used, but had left out in plain sight. A pen that I distinctly remembered leaving on the kitchen counter was gone, and a loose sheet of paper that I had set on the windowsill to dry was nowhere to be found. It was odd. Little things, but they started to build up, like a crack in the wall that spread wider every day. It wasn't until I caught a glimpse of Mr. Klein one morning that I realized something far more disturbing was happening. I was sitting at my desk, trying to focus, when I saw him out of the corner of my eye, standing by his window, watching me again. But this time, his gaze didn't feel passive. It felt deliberate, like he was waiting for something. And then, just as I turned to look at him directly, he quickly pulled away from the window, as though he had been caught. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest, a feeling of unease creeping up my spine. Could it be possible? Could he have taken the things that were missing from my house? The thought was irrational, but as I sat there, it started to make a sickening kind of sense. Why else would he be watching me so closely? Why else would he be so interested in my writing? The following day, I found more pages from my manuscript missing. It was as though someone had gone through the entire stack, taking the pieces they wanted. My stomach churned. These were pages I had worked on for weeks. Ideas I had developed with care. What was Mr. Klein after? Why was he so obsessed with my work? I decided to confront him. I had to know if it was him, or if I was just spiraling into madness. I made my way next door, my fists clenched at my sides, my mind racing with questions. When I knocked on the door, it took a moment for Mr. Klein to answer. When he did, he had that same strange, knowing look in his eyes. "Mark, how can I help you?" His voice was calm, almost too calm, like he had been expecting me. I couldn't hold back. "Have you been in my house?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. "Have you been taking things from me?" Mr. Klein raised an eyebrow, but didn't seem surprised. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his tone so cool that it made my skin crawl. "I wouldn't dream of intruding on your personal space. After all, I respect a writer's privacy." There was something in his eyes, a flicker of something dark and cold. That made me doubt his words. I stared at him for a long moment, trying to read his expression, but all I saw was the same quiet, controlled face. Nothing more. "I'm watching you, Mr. Klein," I said, my voice low. "If I find out you're behind this." He smiled, a thin, unsettling smile. "Of course, Mark. I would never want to upset a fellow writer." His words were smooth, like a polished stone rolling across water. But I could sense the subtle threat beneath them, like a promise he didn't need to make in words. I left without another word, but as I walked back to my house, my thoughts spiraled. Something was wrong, and I didn't know how much longer I could ignore it. Mr. Klein wasn't just a neighbor with an odd interest in my writing. He was becoming something far darker, and I was beginning to wonder if I had made a terrible mistake by moving here. That night, as I sat at my desk, the weight of it all pressing down on me, I realized something else. Something even more terrifying. My life was starting to bleed into my work. I spent the next few days in a haze, my thoughts constantly turning over the events that had been unfolding around me. The missing pages, the inexplicable items vanishing from my house, and Mr. Klein's unsettling behavior. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite put together. I had started double-checking the locks on my doors and windows every night, but no matter how many times I went over them, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. Someone who knew me far too well. It wasn't just the stolen pages or the odd comments about my characters. What unsettled me the most was how Mr. Klein seemed to know details of my life. Details I hadn't shared with anyone. He made offhand remarks about my childhood, my struggles with writer's block, and even about my relationships with certain characters I'd never mentioned aloud. It felt like he had been lurking in the shadows of my life, watching me without my knowledge. But the most horrifying realization came when I found a short story in my mailbox one morning. It was handwritten on yellowing paper, the ink smudged in places, as if it had been hurriedly scrawled. I unfolded it with trembling hands, my heart sinking with every word. The story was mine, or at least it was almost exactly like mine. It was a twisted retelling of my latest manuscript, but the details were warped. The characters, who had been born from my mind, were now acting in ways I never intended. The plot that had once been my own had been twisted into something darker, more sinister. And as I read, I realized that some of the events described in the story mirrored my life. Events that hadn't yet happened. The panic hit me like a wave. How could he know all of this? How could Mr. Klein have taken my life and turned it into a story? I felt sick to my stomach, like I was losing control of my own reality. Was I losing my mind? Or was he somehow inside my head, taking my every thought and turning it into his own twisted version? I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed answers. I needed to know what was going on, and I needed to confront Mr. Klein in a way that would finally make him slip. I couldn't let him ruin my life, my work. But as I started planning my next move, I realized something that made my blood run cold. He had already stolen more than just my writing. He had taken my very sense of self. That night, as I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard a noise. Soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The floorboards creaked. A shiver ran through me. I knew someone was in my house. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that familiar, suffocating sense of being watched. I held my breath, hoping the sound would stop. But it didn't. The slow, deliberate creaking of the floorboards continued, and then, just as I was about to move, I heard a faint rustle, like paper being flipped through. I knew at that moment that Mr. Klein had been in my house again. I slipped out of bed, trying not to make a sound, and crept down the hallway toward the study. My pulse thundered in my ears, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. But just as I was about to turn it, the door swung open on its own, and I stumbled back, almost falling over my feet. There, standing in the doorway, was Mr. Klein. He smiled that same unsettling smile, his eyes dark and gleaming with an intensity that sent a chill through me. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out," he said softly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "You're such a fascinating subject, Mark. Your mind, it's full of stories. Stories that I needed." I felt the blood drain from my face. You're the one who's been." I couldn't even finish the sentence. My throat felt tight, constricted. "Yes," he interrupted, his voice low and cold. "I've been watching you, studying you. Your writing, your life. It's all so perfect, so ripe for the taking." He stepped closer, and I instinctively took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "I thought I could do this on my own, you know. But you were always just out of reach. Your ideas, your characters, they were too real, too raw. But now they're mine. All of them." I couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. It was as if I was trapped in one of my own stories, caught in a nightmare of my own creation. And then it hit me. The twist that I hadn't seen before. The terrible truth about Mr. Klein. He wasn't just stealing my ideas. He was stealing my life. I couldn't move. My body felt like it was made of stone, frozen in place by the overwhelming sense of dread that washed over me. Mr. Klein stood in the doorway, his eyes never leaving mine, his smile widening as if he could sense my fear. It was as though he had won some kind of sick victory, and I was the one trapped in his web. "You've been so cooperative, Mark," he said, his voice almost affectionate. "You've given me everything I needed without even realizing it. Your struggles, your triumphs, your pain. Everything. It's all right here in your stories. But now I can finally write my own version, a much better version." I took a shaky step back, my mind racing. You. What do you mean? What are you doing to me? What are you doing with my life? Mr. Klein's expression softened for a moment, as if he were explaining something trivial to a child. Don't you see, Mark? I've been trying to write the perfect story for years. But every time I sit down to write, it's never good enough. It's empty. So I needed something more. I needed something real. And you. His gaze darkened. You've been my inspiration, my muse. But you've been holding back, hiding the best parts of yourself. All that potential you've wasted on your silly little stories, your safe little characters. I'm going to bring out the real you, Mark. I'm going to make you a part of my work. I shook my head, the horror of his words slowly sinking in. You can't just take my life like this. You can't rewrite it. Oh, but I can, he replied smoothly, stepping closer, his voice low and silky. I've already started, haven't I? Those missing pages, the stories I've written, they're not just your ideas, Mark. They're a glimpse into your soul, the way you see the world, the way you want to see yourself. I'm just giving it a little nudge, a little push in the right direction. The room felt smaller, closing in on me. My head spun as I tried to make sense of what he was saying. He was twisting everything, my writing, my thoughts, my life, into something that no longer belonged to me. The fear, the panic, the suffocating realization that I had been living in someone else's story. I had to get away from him. I had to stop him. You're insane, I spat, my voice shaking with anger and fear. You can't control me. You can't take my life. Mr. Klein's smile faded slightly, but there was no hint of remorse in his eyes. Oh, I don't need to control you, Mark. You've already given me everything I need. You're already a part of my story, and once I'm done, once I've finished rewriting everything, no one will remember you. No one will remember the real you, only the version I've created. The words hit me like a slap. My mind raced, trying to come up with a way out, trying to think of anything that could stop this man from destroying everything I had worked for, everything I was. But there was nothing. I felt completely helpless. But then, in the back of my mind, a spark of an idea began to form. It was small, faint, but it was enough to give me hope. If he was watching me, studying me, then I could turn this around. I could use his obsession against him. I know how to stop you, I said, forcing the words out, my voice cold and steady despite the terror that gripped me. Mr. Klein paused, his eyes narrowing. You do? He asked, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. How? I'll write a story, I said, my heart racing. A story about you, about everything you've done. I'll make sure the whole world knows what you are. His expression faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly regained his composure. You think that will stop me, that anyone will believe you? I nodded, my eyes locking with his. Yes, because I'll make them believe it. I'll make sure that everyone knows what you're really doing. You've made one mistake, Mr. Klein. You've underestimated me. And now I'm going to use your obsession against you. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a crack in his facade. But it was brief, vanishing almost as soon as it appeared. You think you can stop me with words? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. I'll show you, Mark. You don't control this story anymore. I knew that I had only one shot. If I could catch him in the act, if I could prove what he was doing to me, then I might have a chance to get out of this alive. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed help. The trap was set. The days after my confrontation with Mr. Klein blurred together in a haze of paranoia and careful planning. My mind raced as I formulated the one thing I knew could stop him. Evidence. I had to catch him in the act, make sure there was no room for doubt. He had already broken into my house, stolen my work, and twisted my life into his fiction. If I couldn't prove what he was doing, I'd be lost forever in his story. But how could I outsmart someone who was so far ahead of me? I couldn't trust anyone. Not the police, not even my friends. They would think I was just an eccentric writer with an overactive imagination. Mr. Klein had been careful, meticulous. If he was really watching me, I knew I had to be smarter than him. I had to be patient. For a week, I followed him, keeping a distance, watching his every move. He was predictable, though. Too predictable. Every morning he took a walk around the block, at precisely 7:30 a.m., always turning left when he passed my house. At night, he would sit by his window, staring into my study. I realized he must have been waiting for me to slip up, to let down my guard. But I wasn't going to make that mistake again. I set up cameras. Hidden ones. I placed them around my house and the study, near the back door, even in the kitchen. I needed evidence, and I needed it fast. But I couldn't be sure. What if he knew I was watching him now? What if he had planned for this too? My nerves were shot, my hands shaking as I checked the cameras repeatedly, making sure they were all functioning. I couldn't afford to make a mistake. Finally, it happened. On a quiet Thursday night, as the wind howled outside and rain began to tap against the windows, I saw it on the screen. Mr. Klein slipping into my house through the back door, wearing a dark coat and gloves. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't believe it. He had done it again. He was here in my house just like before. But this time I was ready. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, my fingers fumbling with the buttons. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but I focused on one thing. The trap had been set, and it was working. I told the dispatcher as calmly as I could that there was a break-in, that I had cameras and evidence. I knew I couldn't go back in there to confront him again. It was too risky. But this time he wouldn't get away with it. As I waited, watching the feed on my phone, I saw Mr. Klein move through my house like a shadow, slipping into my study. He didn't seem to notice the camera in the corner. He sat at my desk, and for a long time he just stared at my latest manuscript. I could see his fingers trembling, the way he lingered on the pages, almost reverently. It was then that I understood. The man was desperate. Desperate to steal something that wasn't his, to rewrite my life. I couldn't let him do it anymore. The sound of sirens reached my ears, faint at first, but growing louder. Mr. Klein seemed to hear them too, because he froze, his eyes darting to the door. His expression shifted from focused concentration to panic. He knew his time was running out. But it was too late. The police arrived, and within moments they were swarming into my house, lights flashing, voices shouting. I felt a sick sense of satisfaction as they pulled Mr. Klein from my study, his hands raised in surrender. He didn't fight, didn't resist. It was as if he had known this day would come, and he had no more moves to make. His eyes met mine as they led him out the door, but there was no longer any smugness in them, no dark triumph. Just a hollow emptiness, like a man who had finally realized he'd lost. As the police took him away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had won a battle, but not the war. Mr. Klein's obsession with me, with my life, had been too deep, too consuming. The damage had been done. I would never be able to write the same way again, never feel that sense of freedom that had once come so easily. But at least now I was free of him. Free of the shadow he had cast over my work, my thoughts, and my very existence. I walked into my study, the room where it had all begun, and stared at the desk where he had sat, where he had tried to make my life his own. The pages of my manuscript were scattered across the surface, as if Mr. Klein had left them behind in his frantic search for more. I knew I should feel relief, but all I could feel was a hollow emptiness, as if something precious had been lost in the process. I sat down at my desk, staring at the unfinished pages. But I couldn't write. Not yet. Not after everything that had happened. I needed time to heal, time to rebuild, and time to figure out how to make sure no one, especially someone like Mr. Klein, would ever take my life away from me again. The days after Mr. Klein's arrest felt like a long, drawn-out nightmare finally coming to an end. The police had questioned me thoroughly, taking every piece of evidence I had gathered, including the footage of his break-in. But despite the relief of knowing he was behind bars, I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was still off. My life had been stolen, transformed into someone else's twisted narrative, and even with him gone, I wondered how long it would take for me to reclaim myself. The neighborhood was quiet again. Too quiet. I had moved into this peaceful suburban area to escape the chaos of the city, hoping the tranquility would help me find inspiration again. But now it all felt suffocating, like the calm before a storm I couldn't quite understand. I spent the first few days after Klein's arrest in a daze, trying to piece together my shattered sense of normalcy. The first time I picked up a pen after the incident, I was filled with a strange reluctance. I sat at my desk, staring at the blank page in front of me, my fingers hovering over the keys. What would I write? Where would I even begin? The words I had once been so eager to write now felt distant, foreign, as if they no longer belonged to me. Was I still the same person who had created all those stories? Had Klein stolen more than just my ideas? Had he stolen my ability to create? I couldn't stop thinking about him. About how he had wormed his way into my life, how he had transformed my very existence into a grotesque imitation of his own. And what of the stories he had written, the ones based on my life? I had no idea what he had done with them, whether they had been published or shared. The thought of someone reading those twisted versions of my life made my stomach turn. How many people had already read his work? How many had been taken in by his lies? I spent days trying to track down every scrap of his writing, every page, every word. I couldn't leave it alone. I had to know what he had done with my life, with my stories, and I had to make sure it was erased. But the deeper I dug, the more I uncovered. More plagiarized work, more stories, some of which were disturbingly close to my own unpublished manuscripts. It was as if I had been living inside his fiction, a mere character in his twisted world. But then something happened. As I flipped through one of his notebooks, I came across a name that stopped my heart. It was my name, Mark, and under it, a date, February 10th. The words beneath it chilled me to the bone. Mark will know. Mark will write his own version, and the truth will finally be told. He will remember. He will come back to finish what he started, and this time I will be ready. I dropped the notebook, my hands trembling. I didn't understand. What did this mean? Was he planning to escape? Was he already writing his next chapter, trying to manipulate me again from behind bars? The thought made my skin crawl. The police had assured me that Klein's incarceration would be permanent, that he wouldn't be able to hurt me again. But reading that note, I wasn't so sure anymore. Could I ever truly escape him? Could I ever truly be free of the man who had so thoroughly infiltrated my life? He had left his mark on me, on everything I had created, and no matter how hard I tried to move on, I felt the weight of it dragging me back. The only thing I could do now was write. Write my version. Write the truth and reclaim my life. The stories that had been stolen from me. My life, my thoughts, my soul, were mine to tell. I wouldn't let him win. Not this time. I sat down at my desk once again, the blank page staring back at me. But this time, I didn't hesitate. I didn't question myself. I didn't wonder if I was ready. I just began to write, pouring all the rage, the pain, and the fear I had been carrying into the words. My pen moved across the paper, fast and relentless, as I told my story. And as I wrote, something inside me began to heal. The weight on my chest lifted just a little. I could never forget what had happened, but I could fight back. I could take back what was mine. The man who had tried to rewrite my life would never have that power again. As the pages filled with my words, I realized that this was my real story. Not Mr. Klein's twisted version. Not the lies he had told. This was mine, and it would never be taken from me again. The last words I wrote were simple, but they felt like a declaration, a promise to myself. This is my life. No one can rewrite it. And for the first time in a long while, I felt free.
Thanks for listening. If you like our work, do subscribe because your support helps us keep this channel alive.